In TA100 Pro, as well as all of our desktop products, when you double-click the icon to log into the system, you are greeted with the user ID and the password. Now, the good news is, for all of our desktop products, the user ID and the password are all the same. The user is actually SYSOP, which is S-Y-S-O-P, and if you notice, it does come across in uppercase. That is standard. It will always come across in uppercase. Any user ID that you create when the employee or when the client actually keys it in, it is always in uppercase format. The password is indeed case sensitive, but the password is simply password. Again, the user is SysOp and the password is password. And remember, that works for TA100 Pro, that works for Genesis Pro, that works for Genesis SQL, as well as the new product, TA100 Lite. Once you have gained access into the software, you'll notice to the top left corner, we have our main menu going across the top. And remember, part one of TA100 Pro training is all about from the administrative perspective. So today, we're really going to share with you how to set up a client in TA100 Pro. So we are indeed going to start with System Setup. Under System Setup, we'll come down to the first area, which is Company, and over to Main Company. In the Main Company area, you will find 4 tabs. The first tab is the General tab. In the General tab, this is where you'll find basic company information about the company that you're working with. So this is where you'll put all of their information. Do know the most important item in this particular window is the name field. The name field actually is going to be carried forward in several different places. One place, I don't know if you realized it, but in the login window where I had to key in the SysOp and the password, the name of the company was in that particular window. Again, it's being pulled from this particular section. Also, when I begin to run reports, and we'll actually work with reports on tomorrow, but on all of the reports that you have in the software, across the top of all of the reports is where you will find the company name. And again, that company name is being pulled from this section. The other information here, you will not see that information until you specifically pull an address report. The second tab over is the Configure tab. In the Configure tab, these are all standard basic settings that need to be applied in the system. So the first one, daylight savings. The company that you're working with, do they observe daylight savings? Remember, not all states or counties actually observe daylight savings. For example, here in Arizona, we do not observe daylight savings time. Division. Divisions in our software is totally when we're looking at 2 different companies or 2 different entities that will reside in the same database. That is, of course, the main purpose or the initial purpose of the reason to use division. Now, because divisions also help control security in the software, you can also create divisions for the sole purpose of security as well. In other words, if I had maybe 2 sites, but I was very specific and I only wanted one person or people at site 1 to only have access to site 1's employees versus employees at site 2. Again, all of that could be separated based on division. Remember, divisions are not mandatory in the system. It's just all about how the company intends to use the software. Departments. Departments and jobs are what we refer to as labor levels. Labor levels in the software are indeed items that employees can transfer in and out of throughout the day. Remember, going back to divisions, divisions are not transferable. Literally, when an employee is attached to a division, they're always in that division. It's not as though they're working 2 hours in Division 1 and then switching over to Division 2. Divisions are not transferable from the clock. Departments and jobs, on the other hand, are what we refer to as labor levels. They are indeed transferable. The department and the job information Remember, don't get caught up in those labels. Ultimately, they are only labor levels. You will be able to change those descriptions based in the default section. And I'm sorry, it sounds like we're getting a little bit of feedback from something. Not exactly sure where that's coming from. Thank you so much for handling that. Again, in the department and the job, these are the two items that employees can search and transfer in and out of. So if you are working with a company and maybe they are using divisions and maybe they do need employees to transfer divisions, you can still keep divisions as divisions, but again, they will have a home division per se. But you can also take one of your labor levels and relabel that to be a division as well. And that way they'll have the opportunity to transfer in and out. For lunches and breaks, if in TA100 Pro, your client will actually have employees clocking in and out for lunches and breaks, you do need to activate that feature here. Remember, if you don't activate the feature here, when we arrive into the shift section where lunches and breaks are created from, you will not have access to lunches and breaks. Again, you have to keep that in mind. Activate it here, and then you can create the rules once you arrive into that particular section. To use level wage before default assignment wage. Well, remember when we talk about levels, we're talking about the two labor levels. There are some companies that actually have employees that work or their pay is based on maybe what job they're actually performing. So that is what we would refer to as the level wage. It could be that all, let's say you're working in the hospitality industry, all waitresses will make $3.50. We don't care how long you've been with the company, but if you are working in the job of a waitress, you will make $3.50. That is indeed what we call a level wage. Forget your standard or default wage. You are now connected to a level wage because that level is based on the job level. So the job that you are doing creates a specific rate of pay. If you do need to activate that, again, you would simply check the box here. The next question, paid lunches and breaks do not accrue towards overtime. This question is only applicable if the company that you have decided to work with has indeed decided to pay for lunches and breaks. Now, the majority of the companies that you work with, they do primarily pay for breaks, and most of them don't even have employees punching for breaks. Now, lunches, on the other hand, most companies don't typically pay for lunches. But if the company that you're working with does indeed pay for lunches, and they do not want those lunches to accrue towards overtime, then you do need to activate this feature. But ultimately, remember, if the client is not paying for lunches and breaks, there's nothing you really need to do with this particular question. The use SMTP for email, a little bit later, actually, in training session part 2, we will be showing you how to add users into the software. When you add the users into the software, you will indeed be able to give users an email address, and they can actually send reports via email. So that's what this particular feature is going to be used for. The use login pass-through. The login pass-through says if we have a client that maybe it's a very small company and maybe there's just one person using TA100 Pro and maybe their office is in a controlled environment, they have a locked office and no one really has access to that particular computer. They can make it so, remember when we double-clicked, or actually the software was already open to the login window, but we could make it so that when they double-click the icon from the desktop, it bypassed the whole login window. In other words, they will never have to key in a user ID and a password. So it's what we call a login pass-through. Again, I don't typically promote that in an environment where there are several users or managers in a situation. Again, typically only for very small environments. To the right side, the tip reporting. Tip reporting can be activated and used in the system, meaning if you want employees to report tips from the clock, you will need to activate that feature from this particular window. If you do not activate it from this window, we will not be able to configure the clock to accept tips. Wages. In this software, wages are not mandatory, but certainly you can include wages for reporting purposes. Again, if you want to have wages or your client would like to have wages, simply check the box. The overtime level. In TA100 Pro, remember, you can have up to 3 levels of overtime. Notice OT1 is not listed here because that's the level of overtime that comes with the system or it's activated in the system by default. Typically, when you think of OT1, most people think of time and a half. You know, you work more than 40 hours, you possibly can make time and a half. Well, in addition to time and a half being one level, does that company ever pay double time? Do they ever pay double time and a half or maybe triple time? That's the purpose for these other 2 levels. So if the company only pays time and a half, then you don't have a need to activate overtime level 2 or overtime level 3. I know some companies will say, well, we pay daily overtime. If you work more than 8 hours in a day, it goes into time and a half. Again, that's still one overtime level. You have several ways that you could get to time and a half, but it's still just one overtime level. The use of swipe and go. In the software, when an employee walks up to the clock, we can decide if we want them to swipe the badge and keep moving, or do we want them to swipe their badge and actually indicate if they're clocking in or if they're clocking out. If they simply swipe their badge and keep moving and do not indicate what their function is at the clock at that time, that is what we refer to as swipe and go. In other words, the system will determine the type of punch that that actually is. The use of AM/PM format. In our software, it is by default listed, or all of the time is listed in military format. But you have the opportunity, at least in 2 main sections, one section being the time card, the other section being report. If you want to see those 2 sections in AM/PM format, you can activate that in this area. But remember, that's not activating everything in the software. It's only those 2 sections. So that means when you look at the shift section, all of that is still going to be in military format. When you look at schedules, all of that is going to be in military format. Also, we're not saying what the time will, or how the time will appear at the clock. This is only in the software itself. Remember, the clock is controlled in a different section. So, of course, at the clock, you can indicate if you want it to be displayed in AM/PM or if you want it to be displayed in military or 24-hour time. Do not use floater for shift selection. Well, right now we have not been exposed to shifts just yet. But what we're referring to is any time in the software when we create a shift group automatically creates something that is called a floater. A floater is someone who has the opportunity to work in any one of those shifts that are a part of that shift group. Now, some companies say, well, we don't have any floaters. We created the shift group and everybody has a specific shift that they are associated with, and that's perfectly fine. We have now arrived at a location that will allow you to remove the floater from your shift group. Again, we haven't always had that particular feature. You create a shift group, the shift group automatically created the floater. You could use it or not use it, but it was always there. So now you have the opportunity to completely remove the floater if necessary. The editable pay period. In the software, you will have a time card window where you can review all of your punch information. you can make edits and corrections. But the question here says, well, how many pay periods am I allowed to actually edit? So how many pay periods do you want your client to be able to physically edit? Typically, I always say two. Two representing your current pay period and then, of course, your previous pay period. That, to me, just makes logical sense on the two pay periods that your client should be able to edit. Remember, if they were to edit anything older than that, that information would not be uploaded to payroll because payroll has already been processed. And then, of course, you have to be consistent when you think of even that previous pay period that we're giving them access to. If that previous pay period has already been processed, then I would not encourage department heads or managers or supervisors to make changes even to that previous pay period because it has already been processed. So ultimately the reason I say give them access to the previous pay period is because when you move into a new pay period, you are still wrapping up that previous pay period. You're going in to make those final edits, final corrections, so that you can, of course, create the file that you're sending over to the payroll vendor. The approval editor pay periods back. In the software, you also have another section that we refer to as the approval editor. The approval editor actually shares with you what I call all of your problem employees. Any employee that has a missing punch or any employee that has an absence in the software will actually come across in this particular window. So again, that's why I call it your problem employees. Well, this window says, again, how many pay periods back do you want to be able to see those problem employees? So I typically use the same two cycles. I want to see all of my problem employees for the current pay period and the previous pay period. The goal is that I shouldn't have any problem employees that should be showing up that are any older than that because you really needed to take care of those employees. The auto log out after so many minutes, I can tell the software to automatically log out if it has just been sitting idle for 20 minutes, such as I've probably been talking for 20 minutes in this same window, and I have not clicked cancel or OK. If I had told the system to log out after 10 minutes, then it would probably be logging me out due to inactivity. You can also schedule an auto log out time. So let's say any employees who were still in the software at 10 p.m., you can actually tell the system to go ahead and log the system out at 10 p.m. Again, sometimes supervisors or managers, they may be working in the system and all of a sudden they have a situation on the floor. They have to go out to the floor, handle that, and then maybe by the time they're all done, it's time for them to go. So they don't even think about going back into their office to log out of the software. But again, you can actually put a time that will automatically log anyone out who's working in the system. The PC clock setting. Remember, with TA100 Pro, you do have the opportunity to actually activate what we call a PC clock. A PC clock is almost like a physical clock. The difference being it is a part of your software. Therefore, it appears on your desktop. Here, you can actually set up different features that you want to activate within the PC clock. For example, there are some clients that may decide to take one computer monitor and turn that monitor just into a clock monitor. So that's why they may have a no close button, because the PC or that particular monitor is only used for that purpose. In other words, you can't get on and check your email or anything like that because the window never closes. So they don't have access to a no close or to the X button to close it out. The PC clock is not movable. Again, if that is its only purpose, then we don't want the clock to be able to move it around the page. Put it to the left side, put it to the right side. We actually would create that clock in such a format that it typically takes up all of the space on that particular monitor. You can actually have the buttons, when they click the buttons, you can have the buttons make sounds. All of that is a possibility. So these, again, are just some of the settings that you can identify for your PC clock. The INI settings, again, the INI settings that are actually listed here all have to do with settings that may require something extra about how we have something set up. Prime example, with the new clocks that we're using, the 715s, the 777s, the 785, some of them do require a timeout if you're doing some specific pieces of information. So you see that's a new item that we have listed here. The export tab, again, you'll notice there are two specific exports that are in question here, QuickBooks and Preview. They do have some specific or extra pieces of information that must be connected to them, such as which version of QuickBooks are you using. And again, here in Paychex Preview, do you want to be able to view the pay stub? In other words, the information such as the in punches and out punches, do you want that to be able to be viewed on the Paychex stub? Again, those are your INI settings, typically for custom pieces of information. The regional settings, actually I've never changed this or have seen this change from dollars, but I'm assuming you can certainly change it. The date format, you have American or European, and the date delimiter. The date delimiter is simply the separator between the month, day, and year. So let's say you actually prefer a dash. You can actually switch it out to be a dash. Or if you prefer an asterisk, you can switch it out to be an asterisk. Or even if you prefer a period, you can make that change as well. So it's all about what your end user would prefer to see. The next tab over is the default tab. In the default area, remember, employees. This is all about labels now. In the software, we have it set so employees are listed as employees. But if you're working with a company and maybe they don't refer to their employees as employees, they have another way that they refer to those employees. Here's where you can make that change. Maybe they refer to their employees as associates, or maybe they refer to their employees as cast members. Again, you can make that change here because it's all about what they expect to see. The same with the labor levels. If you recall back on the Configure tab, I did tell you that you were able to change the labor level description. So don't get caught up in the label of department and job. You actually make those labels. So here, I could actually change department over to location if we wanted to. The same with the job. You're in control of this description. The list, the employee list, is all about the employee number. Remember, this software typically mirrors what you have set up in your client or the client's payroll software. If the client is using a payroll vendor that recognizes a 6-digit number, then we need to make sure in this software we recognize a 6-digit number. And is it numeric or is it alphanumeric that represents or completes that employee number? You have to make sure we get that right, because ultimately the one thing that is connected to that employee per payroll is that employee number. That's what links the employee together when we create that export file. It's not the name. We could have 5 employees by the name of Tracy Aikens, but it's all about the employee number that separates those 5 employees. The same with the department codes and the job codes. It's all about what the payroll vendor is using. If the payroll vendor is using a 3-digit department code or a 4-digit job code, that's what we want to mirror here. We have to make sure if we want that information to go across for exporting purposes that we mirror what's already been set up in payroll. The same with the type. If it's numeric or alphanumeric, we have to set that up properly. Think of it this way. Numeric says the number is always numeric, which means I'm going to zero fill the number. If you said the number is a 4-digit number and yet you told me 22, well, I'm going to make that 0022 because it's a 4-digit number. Versus an alphanumeric format, if you said it was 22, then it indeed is just going to be only 22. There's no zero filling of character spaces there. Again, it's just 22. The user-defined fields. Think of this section as custom fields. In TA100 Pro, you do have the opportunity to create up to 6 custom fields. Now, the gotcha here is custom fields are view only. You cannot run reports, you cannot qualify, nor can you sort from these custom fields. So the one custom field that I've decided to use here is actually an emergency number or a 911 number. But of course, you can decide to use any of the other fields. Now, typically, if I'm not using the other fields, I do try to remove them so there are no labels, because you'll see these tomorrow in training session 2. But you will see these actually on the detail screen for each of the employees. So that's why I say it's really a view section. In the badges area, if your company is purchasing badges from Time America, the majority of the badges that we make here are 5-digit in length, and they are 5-digit maximum. So you'll purchase badges from us, and they may be 00001 through 00150 if they purchase 150 badges. But again, they are 5 in length and 5 in max total characters that are available to be used. On the other hand, if you're working with a client and they have indeed decided to use custom badges, or maybe they work with a company now, or maybe that is their personal business, and they just make their own custom badges. First recommendation, very strong recommendation, you need to send those badges in to your prospective sales representative so they can go ahead and test those badges or have technical support test those badges with the possible cost that your client is looking to purchase. You'll want to test those badges and make sure that they indeed do work. Secondly, if they are using custom badges, this is where you will need to control the length and the maximum if those badges are not 5 characters. So let's say they work with a badge that has a total of 10 characters. Well, out of the 10 characters, are they really using all 10, or do they only expect to use 4 of those characters? Again, if they only are using 4, that means the length, of course, would be 4, and the max would be 10. The type, again, depending on the type of badge, again, at Time America, we typically sell numeric badges. We will make alphanumeric badges for your client per request. And if they are purchasing or using custom badges, are those badges going to be numeric or alphanumeric? The automatic badge assignment. In the automatic badge assignment window, this is where we have 3 options. We can certainly tell the system no automatic assignment, meaning that it is up to the end user to input the badge number for each and every employee. This is typically the best way to go, especially if we have multiple people that have the access to add new employees in the software. It simply means they go and get a badge, they look at the badge and say, oh yeah, this is a badge that we are assigning to this employee. The next numeric available, I typically only recommend this particular item if the client is a very small client. There's only one person responsible for adding employees in the software, and that one person has access to all of the badges in one disk, meaning that when the system says, well, this person should be assigned to badge number 25 or 00025, they have access to that badge right there. The same as employee number. I recommend using this particular feature, one, if the company that you're working with has decided to use hand punch units. Remember, the HP 15, the 1000, 2000, 3000, they don't accept badges, but they still require some type of badge number to be used as a clock. So again, I typically say allow it to be the employee number, and there where you don't have to come up with 2 sets of numbers. So the badge number simply becomes the employee number. Now, another time that I recommend also using this, let's say the client that you're working with, they have decided not to actually use physical badges. They are actually going to use pin punching. So the employee walks up to the clock and they actually just pin punch in all of their information. That would be a great reason just to use the employee number. So it's not a new number that they indeed need to use. But again, best recommendation is to keep it at no automatic assignment, and that way everybody is pretty neutral. The last tab that we have here is the Export tab. In the Export tab, this is actually where you can define what payroll export a client is connected to. Do note that there are several different exports that are available here, and you can see them all. Also, there is one listed here, and it says build your delimited export. Do know that it's listed here, but we have to actually turn that feature on for you in TA100 Pro because there is a charge or a fee for that build your own delimited export. Versus in Genesis Pro, Genesis SQL, it actually comes standard. But again, in this product, it is not a standard piece of material. Right? As we continue to come down, do know if there is a payroll export or a payroll package that your particular company that you're working with, you don't see that export listed here, certainly contact your sales representative, and they will be able to tell you if we don't have it listed because it is what I call a semi-custom. For example, Darwin. If you notice, Darwin is not listed here. It is what we call a semi-custom because we only have one standard export for Darwin because it was based on specs from another reseller. So again, that's the Darwin export that we have created. It is a possibility. It may work for your particular client, but it is also a possibility that it may not work because Darwin is a little different, of course, depending on the version. For training today, I'll go ahead and we will just select maybe Prime Pay. So if you notice, once I've highlighted it, I'll click Select. It appears to the right side. And below, this button says Display Only this export. But when the client will go into the system to actually create the export file, I typically only want them to see this export. I don't need them to see this long list of all the possible exports that they could be using. I only want them to see the Prime Pay export file. So here at the bottom, I'll click Display Only this export, and it tells me that Prime Pay is now the only export in the Reports Export section. At the bottom, I'll click OK here, so that means any changes that I've made here or here or here will now all be accepted. Any questions about the main company? From the main company, if you recall, we did activate divisions. So that means if I go back to System Companies, I now have divisions open and available for me. Remember, divisions are where we are creating separate entities or separate companies or clients, or I won't say clients, but sometimes companies do refer to other sub-entities as clients for them. At the bottom, I'll click Add, and we'll go ahead and add a new division into this window. Notice it automatically comes up as Division 3 because it's thinking when you have Division 1, you have Division 2, the logical item would be number 3. But remember, the client or you are in control of that particular number. So if I wanted to make it 1212, I could do that. Or if I wanted to make it 2500, I could do that. I'm not just subjected to keeping it as 003. But for training purposes, I first will keep it at number 3. I'm going to make this the New York division. It is active, meaning that when we arrive in this section where we can assign this, I do indeed want it to be available to be assigned out to an employee. The address. In the address area, this is where I could key in all of the address information for this particular division. But ultimately, remember, the most important thing is always the name. The address information, zip code, phone number, fax number, you'll typically not see that again in the system unless you specifically request an address report. Now, the field information. The field information can be used for different purposes. So if we are using divisions in the system, and when we create the export file, we want to be able to tell those divisions apart. Well, you can create a division code. So here, this is actually going to be number 3. I could key it in as number 3. So literally when the file is created, it would add that 3 into the name of that particular division. So that's how you could separate them or tell them apart. Some payroll vendors also have what they may call sub-company codes or division codes. All of those are possibilities, or branch codes. So that's why we do indeed give you 3 possible fields that you can use for all of those identifiers. Again, 1, it only matters if they are indeed going to use divisions, and if the divisions are indeed going to be used for separate payroll exports, then you may want to consider identifying those different divisions. Here at the bottom, I'll go ahead and click OK, and clearly you can see that we have added a new division to the left side of the screen. And speaking of the left side of the screen, this format that you see in divisions, this will be the format going forward. Where the left side of the screen, you'll always see a list of whatever section we're working in. So we're working in divisions. So you'll see a list of divisions to the left side. To the right side, that is how you can add something new or edit a current division. In the bottom left corner, this actually controls how the information is presented. Is it presented in numerical order based on the code, or is it presented in alpha order based on the name? Right now it is in numerical order, but we could switch it over to name, and it puts everything in alpha order. To show inactive, remember when we added New York into the system, we decided that it was indeed an active division. Well, let's say a year from now, the New York division is no more. You wouldn't want to delete it out of the system because employees would have time and attendance associated with it, and you would never be able to go back and run reports because you've officially deleted it. Therefore, I'd recommend that you make it inactive. To make something inactive, you would just go back into edit mode, uncheck active, and it becomes an inactive item. So here in the bottom left corner, because we told the system we wanted to see inactive items, notice how New York and the code actually has a little asterisk next to it. And now in the top window, it tells us that New York is inactive. If I uncheck this box, it would actually remove New York from the listing. Therefore, I'm only viewing my active division. So I don't always have to view inactive and active information. So if I want to, I can check the box and it comes back. If I highlight New York, click Edit again, I can simply go back in and make it active, click OK, and that item is back in place. So if I uncheck it, New York is still there because it is an active division. Also, you'll notice the arrow here. This is just an expansion window. So maybe we had very long descriptions for our division. Well, if you close it, not a whole lot of information you can actually see there. But if we expand it, we can certainly have more written or name description information available for viewing purposes. Any questions about the division section? All right, at the bottom, we'll go ahead and close here. I'll take you back to System Setup, and now we're coming down to Categories. In the Category section, notice the schematic of this area, same as I presented divisions. The left side of the screen will have a list of all of the categories. Remember, these are standard categories that automatically come with the software. Not saying that your client will use all of these possible categories, because 9 out of 10 they definitely will not. Which is why when I go through this with my client, we actually have something that's called the questionnaire review. So they get this long document, they fill out the information, and then we discuss it. Based on that conversation, when they tell me exactly what categories, or you may know them as pay types, or what categories or pay types they are definitely using in the software, and those are the only categories or pay types that I am going to build for them here. Not that I'm going to delete all of the others, I'm simply going to make them inactive. And by making them inactive, they do not appear in this window once I uncheck the Show Inactive link. Right? Because again, if they see things that they're not sure of, people have a tendency to use that information. And I don't want them to use that information and it does not have an export code associated with it. So I have found the safest way to do this is to only allow them to see what their particular company is using, because that's what they have an export code for. So speaking of a category, remember a category is the type of time that a client can use. It can be time as in hours, or it could be something that is actually paid in dollars, such as bonuses, tips, commissions. All of those are possible items. They are what we consider to be a category. At the bottom, we'll walk you through building a category. Click Add here. I'm actually going to build, let's make this a bonus. Here, the code bonus equals category number from hand reader. So if I had clients that were actually going to use, or employees that were actually going to use the hand reader, if I wanted them to enter a bonus for themselves at the hand reader, I can actually give it a number so it comes up in a little window and they can actually associate with bonus and they would be able to pay it. Again, here, the majority of the clients that I work with never allow their employees to actually input something like this directly from the hand reader. I would say very, very few actually allow that. So we'll keep it at 0 for now. The name, I am going to go ahead and key this in as bonus. Do notice the name I did key it in uppercase, and that's just so it blends with the left side of the screen. All of these items that are listed here are already in uppercase as well. Active, I do want this item to remain active because we want to be able to assign it or grant it to an employee. And export. Well, if we want bonus to actually go across to the payroll export, then you definitely need to check this box. Notice, checking this box will actually activate the export code tab. By activating this particular tab, this is where I can now key in the export code that should be assigned to bonus. Now remember, where your export code comes from, it comes directly from the payroll vendor. We, at least I here at Time America, I have no idea what the export code is. I can't tell the client what the export code is. That's only something the payroll vendor can give to them. In other words, when we send this information to payroll and it drops into payroll, how does bonus know to drop right into the bonus field? How does PTO know to drop right into the PTO field? Because one, payroll is expecting that information, and therefore it has some type of code that represents that particular pay type or category. The hours and dollars. In the hours and dollars information, this is where we're determining, well, the pay type that we're building or the category that we're building, is it going to be something that is paid in hours or is it going to be something that is paid in dollars? If it is something that is going to be paid in hours, then of course you have to answer the questions listed. But if it is paid in dollars, remember dollar is a flat dollar amount. These other questions are not valid. Let's switch it back to hours though. Let's pretend for a moment that bonus is something that will be paid in hours. So the first question says the miscellaneous entry overrides absent. The miscellaneous entry in question here is of course what we are building. So we're building bonus. So just kind of rephrase the question and say, bonus overrides absence. Well, if that's true, then you can check the box. Sometimes it just depends on the item that you are creating. I would probably not say that bonus overrides an absence, but perhaps if I was building PTO or if I was building holiday, I would say that those items do indeed override an absence. The second question, miscellaneous entry overrides holiday minimum hours. So again, replace the miscellaneous entry with bonus overrides holiday minimum hours. Now, we haven't arrived in the section that talks about holiday minimum hours. That is actually what we consider to be a part of your policy section. When we set up holidays, we can have such rules that say, well, you have to work the day before, you have to work the day after the holiday, and on the day before and the day after, you have to work a minimum of 6 hours. Well, suppose the day before the employee had a bonus day, or the day after they had a bonus day. Does bonus override the holiday minimum hours, so those 6 hours? Does bonus take the place of those 6 supposedly worked hours? If so, you can check the box here. And is the miscellaneous entry paid? So is bonus paid? And it sounds like a strange question, but remember, sometimes clients create categories for tracking purposes, not so much for payment purposes. Maybe we're building something that could be called sick unpaid. We want to know that the employee was sick on this day, but we also want to know that we did not pay them for that time. So it's something that we're tracking, but we're not actually paying. If the entry is indeed paid, then the follow-up question to that is, can this category be overtime? Again, the question here is not, does it accrue or apply towards overtime, but can it physically be paid out at overtime? If so, you would need to check the box here. And the last question, the post-to-benefit entitlement. If they are able, or one, if your client is going to use benefit entitlements in the software, then they would need to activate this particular feature. Now remember, we have benefit entitlements and the software. You can also purchase what we call benefit accruals. Benefit entitlements are where you go in and you say, yes, every year this employee gets 40 hours. It doesn't change for the life. It continues to give that employee 40 hours. But benefit accruals, on the other hand, that's where you can, one, base benefit accrual information off of work time. So if every hour the employee works, they get 0.015 hours of PTO for every hour that they work. Again, that's a benefit accrual. Or if I said, well, they get 40 hours the first 3 years, after that it goes up to another number, that's a benefit accrual because we are creating the stages that that benefit is actually turning over. Again, you can't do any of that with benefit entitlement. Benefit entitlement is you're entitled to 40 hours for the life of that particular benefit, and that's what we're doing. Here, bonus, of course, is not going to be any of this because it is not going to be paid in hours. It is indeed going to be paid in dollars. But before I move it to dollars, I do want to show you the export code section. In the export code section, think of this first row, the none row, as being the most important row. The differentials that you see listed, D1, D2, D3, these are all differentials. In TA100 Pro, you have the opportunity to use up to 3 differentials. If you're planning to use differentials, then you want to know what pay types or categories can be associated with differentials. If this category that you're building can ever be paid out with a differential, then yes, you do need a differential export code. But if this category can never be paid out with a differential, you do not require a differential export code. The majority of the clients that use differentials, they typically use differentials with work time only. In other words, when the employee is working, if they are connected to a differential, then we want to make sure that we establish that work time as differential. But again, most companies don't typically pay out PTO associated with differential. That's just PTO. But again, you do have some companies that will. So it just depends on how the company that you're working with operates. Here, if I go back and I switch this over to dollars, notice the difference here. The difference here is I only have one column and one row that I need to question. Because remember, a dollar item is paid at a flat rate. So I just need to make sure that we get that dollar amount back into payroll. Because it's all a dollar flat rate, that's all I need to be concerned with. You'll also find to the right side that there is something that's called a field code. Currently, right now, there is only one payroll vendor that I know of that uses a field code, and that, of course, is ADP. The way ADP works, they could take, let's say they took vacation, they took personal time. In this item, and I'll go here, in the regular column, let's say vacation, sick, personal, PTO, all of those were listed as 16. So everything drops into the same bucket. So everything goes into one bucket. But when it gets into this one big bucket, it then separates out from that one big bucket. It separates out according to what they call a field code. So vacation, it may be listed as a V. Sick may be listed as an S, or PTO could be listed as P. And that's how it's going to separate out from 16, everything dropping into the same bucket, and then it will separate out based on the field code. But again, ADP is the only current vendor that I know actually uses a field code. Here for this export, I'll just make this a 19 for our bonus. I'll, of course, switch it back to dollars. And notice 19 is the only item that I need. At the bottom, I'll click OK here. And we have just added a new category into the software. Any questions about the category section? I cannot tell you how critical the category section is, because think of this area as the bridge that actually links your information or transfers your information into payroll. If your export codes, and typically that's the one main item when clients say, well, oh, our export isn't working. Well, do you have export codes in place? Are the export codes correct? And that's typically where the downfall is. We'll go ahead and close here. Take us back to system, and now we're coming down to policies. In the policy section, this is where we are looking at or separating out the different types of employees that a client can actually have at one location. Typically how I start this conversation with a client is I'll say I have 3 questions that I want to pose to you. And depending on how they answer those 3 questions, then that will tell me how many policies I ultimately need. My first question is always about the pay period. Is it safe to say that all of your employees work in the same pay period? If they say yes, everybody works in a weekly cycle, everybody works in a biweekly cycle, then we know that we're looking at one policy. But if they said no, I have some people that work in a weekly cycle, some people that work in a biweekly cycle, then of course I know I'm looking at 2 different policies. Because again, pay periods are controlled as a part of the policy. The second question has to do with holiday. Is it safe to say that everyone here receives holiday pay? If so, do they all receive the same amount of holiday pay? If they say, well, no, not everyone receives holiday pay, our part-time employees don't receive holiday pay. So that means now I'm looking at a policy just for part-time people. And then what about the people that do receive holiday pay? Suppose they said, well, you know, we pay some of our employees 10 hours of holiday, and of course we pay some of our employees 8 hours of holiday. Again, I'm now looking at least 3 different policies based on how the holiday is. And then if they have some part-time employees that are weekly and some part-time employees that are biweekly, and then some of those full-time 8-hour employees are weekly and biweekly, the same for the 12 hours, all of a sudden now I've made it up to 6 policies. My third and final question typically has to do with overtime. Is it safe to say that all of your employees receive overtime? Most companies will typically say yes. So you always need to follow up with, tell me the expectations for your salary employees. Are you planning to include salary employees in the system? Because if so, we need to create a policy for that. And typically, salary employees do not receive overtime. So what is the expectation? Are they going to be included in the software? Are they not included in the software? Are you expecting them to punch? Are you expecting them not to punch? What is the expectation? So again, those are the 3 questions that will give me some idea of how many policies I need to create. But let's have a look at the standard policy that's already in place. Here at the bottom, notice I just clicked Edit. The code is already carved in stone because notice, once you add something into the system, you cannot go back and edit the code. We can edit the name or the description, but I cannot edit the code. In the name, of course, I can change that or relabel that. I like to create the name based on the conversation that I had with the client during the Q review. Triggers or labels that they may have associated with it. They prefer to call these as full-time. You know, maybe they want to do full-time 8, full-time 12, part-time, no holiday. In that time, labeling the policies, because they are the ones who will need to assign these policies to the employees at the appropriate time. So I want to make sure that they know when they see the policy exactly what it means. Active, of course, we are going to leave it as active because it is indeed a current policy. And then for the pay period, remember, policy, as I told you, is where you're defining the pay cycle for a particular policy. So this is where we can decide if it's weekly, biweekly, semi-monthly, or monthly. The start date information that you have to the left side is all about the start date, meaning what day of the week is it officially associated with. Because believe it or not, you have to go back to what their overtime cycle is. So if a client says, yes, we run a weekly overtime cycle, then my question is, well, what day of the week does that cycle start? Is it a Wednesday through Tuesday overtime? Is it a Saturday through Friday overtime cycle? Because that's the day that I need to include as the start date. And typically for the start date, we always use the first of the month because we know that every month has a first of the month. So it always is indeed the best option to use. Here you'll notice that it is catering to a Sunday. That means the overtime cycle is a Sunday through Saturday. But again, if I was working with a client and they say, no, our cycle is Monday through Sunday. So that means I'm looking for a Monday that starts on the first of the month. So I could actually use, let's say, March. And we can go to 2010. Oh, come on. I use 2010 of March. That gives me a Monday. And that way, it also tells you that the current pay period as of today is actually July 12th through July 18th. That would be the current pay cycle for this particular client. Now, here's the got you. What if the client that you are working with has indicated we work with a biweekly cycle? A biweekly cycle has the opportunity to have 2 periods. It has what we call an odd period and an even period. Why? Because let me give you this example. Maybe we're going to start this on, let's say we're going to start this on, what's a good day? A Thursday. So if I said April, make sure we don't yield the same dates. If we said April 1st, notice the date cycle yields here. This is actually July 8th through July 21st. But then if I went back and said, what if we made this July 1st? Notice the difference. The cycle then changes. The cycle now is a reflection of July 1st through July 14th. All just based on still a Thursday. So first of the month, still a Thursday, either April 1st, which yielded July 8th through July 21st, or when we use July 1, actually yielded a cycle of July 1 through July 14th. So again, it just depends on the Thursday, which is typically why when I work with a client and they say that they're definitely using a biweekly cycle, I want to know what is the current pay period that you're working in right now, so that when I start to determine are they on an odd or an even, I know that I'm on the right cycle with the particular client. The semi-monthly is where we have to determine the number of days in a true cycle. Keep in mind, most clients that do semi-monthly do indeed do the 1st through the 15th and then the 16th to the end of the month. So a standard number of days that are always the same, they never change, that of course would be the 1st through the 15th. I'd never use the 16th to the end of the month because we know some months have 30 days, some months have 31 days, some months have 28 days. So it's just never a good thing to use. That is why you have to look at, because not all clients use the 1st through the 15th. You could find in some places, some clients will say, well, we use a semi-monthly cycle, but we use the 5th through the 20th and then the 21st through the 4th. They have dates, not just to the end of the month. They have physical dates. But again, what cycle always has the same number of days? That, of course, is going to be the 5th through the 20th, because the 21st through the 4th could certainly have more or less days in some cycles, depending on if the month is a 30-day month or a 31-day month or a 28-day month. So again, you always go with what is standard. Monthly. Well, monthly is easy. Doesn't give you that quite a number of headaches. It's very easy to determine. The gotcha here is, though, some clients don't always start on the 1st of the month. Some clients may say, well, yes, we use a monthly cycle, but we start on the 5th of the month. Not a problem. Again, here, you just want to make sure it is on the 5th of the month. And the other thing that you want to make sure of here as well, is it on the 5th of the month that you're looking for, has to be on the day that their overtime cycle occurs. So if they said our overtime cycle actually runs Monday through Sunday, then again, I'm looking at a 5th of the month that actually starts on a Monday. So in that case, I would probably use April 5th, because April 5th, 2010 is actually a Monday, and that's going to give me the Monday through Sunday overtime cycle. The punch default. In the punch default area, it starts with the ignore of the duplicate and the opposing punch time. Both of those, by default, I typically leave set at 2 minutes, meaning that for the duplicate, if an employee walks up to the clock and they clock in, so let's say maybe they turn around, they start chit-chatting, and all of a sudden they really can't remember what time they actually, or did they clock in at all. So they go back and they try to clock in again. If that second punch is within 2 minutes of the first punch, again, it's going to be viewed as a duplicate, so it will not accept it. Now, the opposing punch time, maybe an employee has clocked out and they have almost made it to their car, and I'm saying, oh, no, come back. We really need you to do something else for us. And they do indeed decide to come back, and they clock in. When they do clock in, if that out punch and in punch are within 2 minutes, I can tell the system to basically ignore both of those punches and pretend none of those ever have happened, basically deciding that the employee never left the building in the first place. Again, all of that is a possibility. You can, of course, increase these, or if you want to see every possible punch and the client can then go back and then make that decision, you can, of course, change it to 0. The missing out punch limit. The missing out punch limit, I typically recommend you leave it at 18. Now, the purpose of that, you have to think, when an employee clocks in and when an employee clocks out, the longest in one day that you ever expect an employee to work? If you leave this set at 12, and maybe this employee did a double shift, 16 hours, essentially you would never be able to see the in punch and the out punch link up because you told the system that no one ever works more than 12 hours. And it's nothing that your client can do in that time card window to try to fix that situation because it's fixed back here. We said no one ever works more than 12 hours. So hence, that's why I recommend 18 is typically a good number because even if the client does a double shift, we're still covered. So default work total 2. We do have something in the system that will allow the system that if an employee clocked in but failed to clock out, I could tell the software to go ahead and give that employee 8 hours. Now, I'm not a fan of default work totals, but certainly you could do so. The maximum out punch link back to the next in punch. In this case, if an employee, let's say, has what we call a split shift, maybe the employee works 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., and then they come back to work at 3 p.m. and they work until 9 p.m. That is indeed a split shift. That is a split shift that is about 6 hours from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. If this particular company has what we call daily overtime, meaning they're in a city or state that pays daily overtime, and they need those two shifts to link together to pay out that daily overtime for that employee, then this is how I can make that happen. I can make this 6 hours, and it will know to link those two shifts together. Now, a few things to consider. If the company doesn't pay daily overtime, not a big deal. If the company doesn't have split shifts, not a big deal here. So it's all about how they're using the system. The first change punch accrues to previous in punch. First change punch going back to, maybe you have a scenario where employees come to work, they clock in, but then they go into this meeting. And in this meeting, this is where they are being given instructions with regards to what they are going to do today. If they are working on job 525, this is where they're finding that information out. So they go into this 15-minute meeting. They have further instructions. They can now go back to the clock, and at that point, they will transfer into that job. Well, the question is, those first 15 minutes that they clocked in, they were not associated to that job. Do we want those first 15 minutes to also be associated with that transfer that they are now doing, which is the first change punch for that particular employee? And it's just saying, go back and grab that first 15 minutes when I came in, because that was the previous in punch. The reset swipe and go at midnight. Remember we talked about swipe and go earlier. It's just where the employees walk up to the clock, swipe the badge, and keep going. And the system will determine if it is an in punch or if it is an out punch. If you're going to use swipe and go, then you have to consider a reset of swipe and go. The reset in TA100 Pro only happens at midnight, versus in Genesis Pro or Genesis SQL, we can tell it exactly if it's at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or 4. You have some other options. But in this product, it only happens at midnight. The question here that I always try to have clients remember, if you have employees that work across midnight, then typically you do not want to reset swipe and go at midnight. Because all of those employees that came in at 10 p.m. and they clocked in at 10 p.m., but then if you go and reset swipe and go at midnight, that means when those employees clock out at 7 a.m., the system will see it as a clock in because you've reset swipe and go at midnight to start all over. So now it's saying any punches I see now should be considered as in punches. But that's not the case because you have employees that work across midnight. The next tab over is the holidays. In the holidays section, one, we have the eligibility to determine if the employee is actually eligible to receive holiday. If they've been with the company 30 days, 45 days, 60 days, 90 days, whatever the standard rule is. Required to work the scheduled day. Again, this is what I talked a little bit about earlier. We can tell the system that we are requiring people to work the scheduled day before and after the holiday. Or is it just one or the other? Or maybe none of that at all matters. If it does matter, in addition to you having to work the scheduled day before and or after, I can even put a number of minutes that I expect you to work. So if I expect you to work 4 hours the day before, 4 hours the day after, that's the minimum requirement. You have to work at least the 4 hours. So if you didn't work 4 hours the day before and 4 hours the day after, you would not qualify to receive holiday pay. Now, let's say you do meet the eligibility requirements. How much holiday pay will you be paid? That's the holiday parameters. Here it says apply holiday when not scheduled to work. This is a very valid question. The question here is simply saying, well, do we only pay holidays to people that were scheduled to work on the holiday? Or it doesn't matter if you were scheduled to work or not scheduled to work, you still get the holiday. If it is the latter, then you would indeed check the box. But if we only pay employees who were scheduled to work on the holiday, then you would not check the box. Holiday hours can accrue towards overtime. For the holiday hours that we're paying you, does the company allow holiday hours to accrue? If so, you'll check the box. If not, don't check the box. Now, hours to add for each worked holiday. So if you come in, or if an employee comes in and they work on the holiday, in addition to the physical hours that they work, do we also give them a lump sum of holiday hours, such as 8 hours? Some companies will say, yes, an employee may come in and work 4 hours, but they're still going to get their 8 hours of holiday pay. It's all about what their company rules are. Some companies may say, no, that's not how we do it. What we do is we take the actual hours that you work, and maybe we pay that at a 1-to-1 ratio. So if you physically come in and you work 4 hours, then we're going to give you 4 hours of holiday pay. Or some companies may say, well, no, we do it at a ratio of 1.5. So if you physically come in and work 4 hours, then we're going to give you 6 hours of holiday pay. It all depends. Now, some companies may say, well, no, we don't do any of that at all. If you come in, you work on the holiday, then we can actually say the physical hours that you work are basically just paid at time and a half, but there's nothing in addition to the hours that you work. So all of those are possibilities. Now, hours to add for each unworked holiday. So again, this is when the employee does not come to work at all. We can simply give them their 8 hours of holiday pay. We can give them a lump sum because they're not working. So what are we going to do? Now, the given minimum, the given maximum, this kind of goes back to if employees work on the holiday. Let's say an employee does come in and they work on the holiday, and maybe we're doing the 1-to-1 ratio, but maybe the employee only worked 3 hours. Well, maybe we want to at least make sure that everybody gets 5 hours of holiday pay. So we can put in a minimum that they would receive of holiday pay. So yes, you're coming in, you're doing the 1-to-1 ratio, but you only work for 3 hours. We at least want to go ahead and give you 5 hours of holiday pay. But at the same time, we don't want to have people coming in on the holiday and working 12 hours and thinking we're going to give them 12 hours of holiday. Maybe the max is just 8 hours. So if you come in, you work 10 hours, we're not going to give you 10 hours of holiday. We're only going to give you 8 because 8 is the maximum that we're going to pay out. So again, all of those are stipulations that you can put in place as well. Now, the beginning pay rate if holiday is worked, the standard rule, again, if you are going to do that, you can put in OT1 or OT2. Now, notice there is a secondary. When you build holidays in the software, because we haven't got to the section where you actually define what days are considered to be holidays, But when you build those holidays in the system, you can actually at that time indicate if this is what we call a secondary rate holiday. For example, I have some clients that say, well, if you come in, you work on Independence Day, maybe we pay you OT1. But if you happen to come in and you work on Christmas, Christmas is actually paid out at OT2. Or Thanksgiving is paid out at OT2. So this is where you would define what that secondary rate is. And when you build the Christmas holiday, you would check the box and say apply to secondary rate. Or when you built the Thanksgiving holiday, you would check the box and say this is a secondary rate. But again, you have to activate it in the policy as well. It kind of works in two places. The overtime tab. In this section of the software, you do have the opportunity to create an overtime cycle. The overtime cycle, unlike the pay cycle, they're very similar. Remember, you could have an employee that's semi-monthly or monthly, but still actually use a weekly overtime cycle. The most common overtime cycles, of course, are weekly and biweekly. But again, you could have semi-monthly, you could have monthly. The most common, weekly and biweekly. The most common, of course, is always weekly. The overtime definition, well, this is where you're defining what OT1, OT2, or OT3 are. Now remember, back in the main company, OT1 was always ours. It was always open and available. OT2 we had to activate if we were planning to use it, and OT3 we had to plan to use by activating it back in the main company. Notice OT3 is not available, because back in the main company, we did not officially activate that item to be used. Here in OT1, we've set a period limit, which is 40 hours. And therefore, the rule is if this employee works more than 40 hours, anything over that in a weekly overtime cycle would be viewed as time and a half. Now, OT2, it has a period limit of all 9, which means it's an infinity. But the multiplier that it uses is actually 2. So what does that tell us? That means that I can actually activate this to be used in some very specific way, such as back in the holiday section. Remember we said the beginning pay rate or the secondary pay rate was OT2. So again, if I'm going to activate OT2, that means I had to define a rule for it. I could also have said, such as is listed here, if an employee comes in on Sunday, any time that you work on Sunday is automatically paid at OT2. Also notice Saturday, anytime you work on Saturday, it's automatically paid at OT1. Now, some other things that you can do. Notice Monday through Friday. That starts at regular, but anything more than 8 hours drops into the OT1 column. You could take it a step further, and you can say, well, anything more than 12 hours drops into the OT2 column. And that's how you just activated the OT2 column on those particular days. Now, if the client has employees that work across midnight, you have to decide how you're going to handle this. Reset at day end. The day end is actually 11:59. So basically 12 o'clock, it's resetting. If you have employees that work across midnight, then you probably don't want to reset this at the day end. But if you don't have employees that work across midnight, I would highly encourage you to reset at day end. So consecutive days. In the software, you do have the opportunity to create overtime based on consecutive days. Most popular is, 6 consecutive days. Is if an employee works 6 consecutive days, then on the 7th day, we can tell the software to make that overtime. But we can also attach some rules to it. So all 6 of those days, we could set a minimum requirement that says, well, on each of those 6 days, they had to at least work 5 hours. So if on all 6 of those days, employees at least worked 5 hours, and then if on all 6 of those days, they actually at least had more than 40 hours, then I could tell the software on the 7th day, go ahead and make this OT1, just by default. The 7th day automatically pays out at OT1, as long as those prior 6 days follow this rule. Now, what about on the 7th day itself? So here's the box that says on days that qualify. So this is the 7th day. On the 7th day, I could tell the software, well, if they work more than 5 hours, or as they say, after 5 hours, I can tell the system to go into OT1. So any hours that are more than 5 would then go into double time. Now, if you notice, there are 2 more rows that you could potentially activate here. But remember, you have to think about the overtime cycle in question. The overtime cycle here is a weekly overtime. So I'm pretty much done. I'm going to reset overtime at the end of the cycle because I don't want this employee to start the next week and they're still looking at overtime because we didn't reset at the overtime cycle end, which is the weekly. But let's say we move this to monthly. Well, you may have something that talks about what happens after 15 or something that talks about what happens after 25. All of that is indeed a possibility. Okay. The next tab over is the differential. In the differential, I spoke about it earlier, indicating that you can have up to 3 differentials. Differentials in the system are what we see as things that you can add into addition, meaning this employee gets an extra 50 cents or this employee gets an extra $1 for every hour. That's in addition to. Or it could be based on a multiplier. If this employee typically makes $10 and we're going to multiply that times 2 and now the employee makes $20. All of that is indeed a possibility. So it can be an addition or a multiplier. And this is where you can put the amount. Now, again, let me say this. The amount is not mandatory. I always like to say that, although it makes it easier for you to see when an employee has differential because you can see what the amounts are or which differential they were in, but the amounts are not mandatory. I have had clients that say, well, no, we don't want to give you amounts. We just want to know when they're working in differential 1 versus differential 2 or differential 3. Not a problem. Because essentially, that's the only thing that the system is going to export out is how many hours in differential 1 does this employee have. We typically, well, really, we don't care about the amount. But for reporting purposes, it is good to have the amount. And then is the differential fixed to the end? Because let's say if I gave you a scenario of employees that work 7 to 3, they receive no differential. But employees that work 3 to 11, maybe they receive a $1 differential. And then employees that work 11 to 7 receive a $2 differential. Well, what happens if you have an employee that came in at 7 o'clock and did not depart at 7 a.m. and did not depart until 5 p.m.? Would you want that employee to receive the differential from working 3 to 5? Because 3 to 5, there was a differential. Well, it just depends. Some companies say, no, when that employee started their day, they did not start in what was considered a differential. Therefore, they do not receive differential. So if you check this box that says differential is fixed to the end, the employee would not receive the differential because it's fixed to the end punch, which in that case would be 7 a.m., and there's no differential. If you uncheck the box, it means that whatever time the differential is due to kick in, if that employee is working at that time, then they would indeed receive the differential. So if from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. that employee worked and there was differential of, I think it was $1 I indicated, that employee would receive it because the differential is not fixed to the end. So it is a very, very important question. The exceptions. In the exceptions area, think of this as how you can create custom parameter reports or how your end user can create custom parameter reports because it is all about what they want to see in the system. Consecutive work hours, overtime hours, what numbers matter most to your client? I always like to say there really is no right or wrong answers. Yes, some answers are better than others, but there really is no right or wrong answer. For example, I never say, let me see any employees who worked more than 8 hours in a day. Well, 8 hours is the typical number of hours that we expect employees to work. So that's not much of an exception. That's pretty much the normal. So again, there's no right or wrong answers, but there are some better answers. Okay. Remember, again, no right or wrong, but it's all about what the client truly wants to see. Any questions about the policy? Here, if we were going to create a new policy, at the bottom I would click Add. Let's say I am going to copy this from the standard policy. I'll label it as policy number 3, and I'll say this is standard, no holiday. I'll click Yes here. I'll go over to the Holidays tab. I'll completely inactivate that and click OK. And that's my standard policy with no holiday. So typically when you create policies, especially when I talked about you're going to end up with 6 policies or 7 policies, they're easy to create because you can just copy one from the other and then quickly make that one pivotal change about that particular item. Go ahead and close here. Right now it is about 9:34, so it means we've been chatting here about an hour and a half. So I think it is a great time to take our first break of the morning. We will make this about a 10-minute break. So right now it's about 9:34. We will come back at 9:44. Now, I'm not saying that you have to sign off for the go-to meeting or any of that. I'm simply going to put you on hold for 10 minutes, and I'll be back on the phone in 10 minutes. But I'm not canceling the go-to meeting or signing off or anything like that, and I ask that you do the same as well. Again, I'm just going to put you on hold for 10 minutes, and I'll be right back. Thank you.
That was quick. I thought maybe it was like that, like that other one. Okay, I'm ready to go. Oh, we have a meeting today? You don't move there. Email about that. Well, you might check in because maybe they decide to go pay no, that's yes. Just all you need to report out a bunch of money.
Hello? All right, it sounds like we are all back together. Before we continue, though, are there any questions about anything that we have covered just in our short hour and a half? Company categories, policies. I know policies is a very long section. All right, hearing none, then we are moving right along. Still back in system setup. I am coming now down to shifts. In the shift section, you will find, again, to the left side, you can see several different shift groups. Again, all of these items that you see here are nothing more than shift groups. But let's just have a general conversation about shifts. Because one of the first questions that a client may pose to you, are shifts mandatory? We get that a lot. Do you have to use shifts in the system? Well, one thing you have to consider, associated to a shift group are some other things, such as your rounding rules. So all rounding rules are connected to a shift. So if you're working with a client and they want to use specific rounding rules, such as, well, we want time to round to the nearest quarter. Again, well, you need a shift. Or if they have any type of lunch or break rule, such as auto deduction for lunch or auto deduction for break, all of that is applied in the shift. Or if they have any differentials, we talked about the time, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., giving a $1 differential, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., giving a $2 differential. Differentials are built and connected to shifts. Okay? All of that has to go together. So any three of those items make shifts mandatory in the system. If they're using rounding rules, if they're using any auto lunches or breaks, and if they are using differentials, then shifts are mandatory. Now, if they don't plan to do any of those three items, then shifts are not mandatory. That means all of their time is actually viewed as actual time. So again, no shifts mandatory. But any one of those three things that you activate, then you must require a shift. At the bottom, we're just going to add a new shift group into the software. So we'll go ahead and click Add here. We'll code this as 300, and we'll label it as training. It is going to be an active shift. It is not going to be a flex or open shift. The purpose of a flex or open shift, let's say you do have a client and they want to use maybe an auto deduction for lunch, but they don't actually have any specific start and stop times that they want to associate employees with. Well, we can actually create what is called a flex or open shift, meaning that it has no specific start or stop time. It's just for saying, yeah, this is a shift. They can possibly work up to 8 hours, so we'll make it a flex of 8 hours. But because it is flexible, it does mean that the employee could work less hours or the employee could work more hours.
All the remote locations now, they're getting all the whole.
And I think we have someone either in your work environment, but we can actually hear that conversation that's happening. So again, you may want to put your phone on mute at this time.
Yeah, they have all these users now at the remote site logging into the edit. Oh, so slow. Oh.
Can someone possibly handle that for us?
Everybody that's in San Antonio will work adequately. All right, so cost of sales, one of them out there. Well, they're probably looking for VPNs or whatever. They seem to have the structure for me to have a network staff. Like the so they're going to delegate it out rather than. used to be everything.
Yeah, it used to
here.
be the bank that only one or two people here did everything. But now the delegate, you can get your people there, you can get your people
We'll
there.
do the final one. I make sure.
Yeah, they've had, they've had several articles. What updates? I updated yesterday. Microsoft keeps pumping them out.
But, yesterday was the end for XP. Well,
Yeah.
more updates for XP.
Yeah.
Okay. So back to our groups. We will not make this a flex or open. The forecasted hours for floaters are actually, because we will have floaters, so we'll just go ahead and make everything 8 hours. Do know at this time, just due to that work conversation, I have put everyone actually on mute. So again, if you need to communicate with me, you will be restricted to the chat session only. In the bottom of the window for the rounding rules, the first set of rounding rules affects the in punch and the out punch. Here you can click the drop down. You can see which items are available. We actually have one rounding rule that says hourly. We have one that's in and out standard and one that's in and out minute to minute. Here we can always select one of these and then go back in and edit this item. Notice, in TA100 Pro, rounding rules are very, very simple. Nothing, if you have exposure to Genesis Pro or Genesis SQL, nothing quite like that. What you'll find here in the standard rounding rule is that you can actually control 3 pieces of information. You can create a round, a grace, and a doc. In this example, notice the 8 a.m. Again, the 8 a.m. is set for the actual punch time. We can control a round, meaning that if an employee clocks in so many minutes before the scheduled start time, we could have it round to the scheduled start time. So let's say we put in 15 minutes. So now I'm telling the system, anytime from 7:45 to 8 o'clock that an employee clocks in, it all rounds to 8 o'clock. I can also do a grace period. Maybe I'll put in a 5-minute grace period. So now I'm saying anytime the employee clocks in from 8 o'clock to 8:05, all of that time rounds back to 8 o'clock. I could even set a doc if we wanted to. Maybe I'll set a 15-minute doc. At this point, I'm saying anytime the employee clocks in from 8:06 to 8:15, all of that time will then be carried forward to 8:15. That is what we consider a doc. Keep in mind, you can actually create this environment based on any time that your client will instruct you to do. But here is the follow-up question. If an employee clocks in before 7:45, what do we want the system to do? If the employee clocks in after 8:15, what do we want the system to do? In other words, how do we want it to round? That is what we consider outside rounding rules. Because essentially, you have only taken care of a window of time from 7:45 to 8:15, basically a 30-minute window. That's the only time that you're controlling. But what happens outside of that 30 minutes when an employee goes to clock in? You have outside rounding rules. You can make that go to every minute, every 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 15, 30, 60. And then depending on which one of these numbers you choose, you can also split it off so that so many minutes go to the in part of it and so many minutes go to the out part of it. So again, that's the rounded format. So notice here, if you had it set at 15, most people typically do a 7-8 split. So the first 7 minutes go to the first 15, and the 8 or more go to the next 15 minutes. All of that is a possibility. That's what would happen if the employee clocked in before 7:45 or after 8:15. Remember, the software cannot stop anyone from officially clocking in per se. We can tell the system what to do with the punches, but again, we cannot stop them from physically clocking in. The software does not control that. If you're looking for that type of environment, one, you'd have to move up to Genesis Pro, and then you'd have to use what we call profile lockout if you're looking for a desktop product. Certainly, with the web product, Exact Time, it can do that via the web, but because it's what we call a schedule restriction. We're truly restricting people based on a schedule, and it would not allow them to clock in. The stop time. The stop time that we're dealing with, again, you're still creating those same parameters. You have a round, a grace, and a dock. So here, let's say we wanted to put in a 15-minute dock, a 5-minute grace, and a 15-minute round. Using 5 p.m. or 1700 as the stop time, you can see exactly what happens here. In other words, the grace period, if an employee clocks out anywhere from 4:55 up to 5 o'clock, all of that time would then round to 5 o'clock. But if that employee tried to clock out any time from 4:45 up to 4:54, all of that time would round back to 4:45, basically docking that employee. But also note on the other side of that, if an employee is scheduled to stop working at 5 o'clock, any time from 5:01 to 5:15, if that employee clocks out, all of that time would still go back to 5 o'clock. The stop section, in the stop area, you have the opportunity to, again, outside rounding. So the question still becomes, what happens if this employee clocks out before 4:45? What happens if they clock out after 5:15? How do you want the system to round? That's the purpose of your outside rounding rules. It can still be any one of these parameters, 0, 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 15, 30, or 60. Keep in mind, 0 does represent actual time. You can use 15 minutes with a 7-minute split, or you could use 30 minutes with a 15 split, meaning the first 15 minutes go to the previous 30 minutes, and of course 15 or 16 or more would go to the next 30 minutes. So all of those are a possibility. Here I'll make it 15 with a 7/8 split, and we'll keep this one in our standard rounding. The lunch rounding, so if I click the drop down here, I'll look at lunch standard rounding, edit that. The lunch duration, again, what's the time frame of this lunch? Is it for 30 minutes? Is it for 60 minutes? What is the official time frame? The minimum total duration time that overrides any deduction. Here, if I'm saying, well, we do have a deduction that is scheduled to take place. In other words, if we did what we call a round short duration forward to total duration, if the employee is scheduled to be deducted for the full 60 minutes, I could tell the system, well, hold up one second. If they are gone less than 5 minutes, do not take the full duration. So that's what this 5 minutes represents. If they're gone less than 5 minutes, basically don't view this as a lunch. It's nothing at all. But as soon as they turn over to 6 minutes, they could take lunch from 6 minutes to 45 minutes. I'm still going to take the full 60 minutes. The grace out, if there is a grace period, this is where it would need to be confirmed. So again, notice the environment that we've built here. If 12 noon is the official lunch time, if the employee clocks out anywhere from 12 to 12:05, notice it goes back to 12 o'clock. It is as though there was no lunch at all. But then starting at 12:06, Anytime after that, we'll take in the full 60 minutes, because that would be a complete 1 hour to the 1 p.m. Because we did give a 2-minute grace period from 1:02, actually goes back to 1 o'clock. The outside round, so the question here is, if this employee goes beyond the 2-minute grace period, what do you want the system to do? Again, it's the same outside parameters, 0 actual time, 3 minutes, 6 minutes, 15, 30, 60. All of those are a possibility. Here I'm just going to leave this one exactly as it is. For breaks, if we were going to do some type of a break in this particular window, I could actually do break standard. I can do an edit on that. The break duration is set for 15 minutes. What you should find is that the break rounding rule works exactly like the lunch rounding rule. It has the same questions, the minimum, the round, and the grace, and of course any outside rounding rules that you're going to configure. Here I will not worry about adding a break into this particular shift. At the bottom I'll click OK, and then now all I have to do is add the actual shift times into this window. Notice the only thing that we've done is basically create a shell. We gave it a code, we gave it a name, we've confirmed the rounding rules, but we still have no start and stop time. So to the right side, we'll click Add here. The shift number, I always start at shift number 1. The start time, I'm going to make this 6 a.m. The cutoff time. Cutoff times come into place if we were actually going to use what we call those, not forecasted, but our rounded or times for an employee, the floaters. It's where we can define what shift an employee is associated with based on what time they clock in. So in this case, if I make the cutoff here at 6:30, I'm literally saying any employee that comes to work before 6:30 would be associated with the 6 a.m. shift. Because if you are a floater, it means that you have the possibility to working in any one of these particular shifts. Here I'll make this cutoff for 3 p.m. or 1500. Remember, everything is still in military format. The process on the in or the out, this question in this case is not necessarily valid because both my start and stop end up on the same day. If we were working across midnight, maybe I was creating a shift that said the start time was at 10 p.m., the stop time was at 7 a.m. The question here says, well, what day do you want all of the hours to go to? Do they go towards the in punch day or do they go towards the out punch day? Again, in this case, we're just going to leave everything on the in because both punches are both start and stops are connected to the end day. And now for my lunch and break rules. I can tell the system that I am expecting employees to punch for lunch. I can also, in addition to having them punch, I can do what we call elapse or auto deduction. Here I'll keep both of these activated because to the bottom, this is where I can say lunch, and if lunch is paid, I can check the box because sometimes clients do pay for lunch and yet they still want employees to punch for lunch as well. So again, if it is a paid lunch, you simply check the box. Now, the elapse deduct section, this is only available because we activated the radio button for elapsed time. This is where I'm telling the software how many hours do you want to confirm that this employee is working before the shift is available, before the lunch is made available. Here I can say 5 hours or I could do 6 hours, but is it 6 hours from the shift or 6 hours from the actual punch? Shift meaning 6 hours from 6 a.m. or punch meaning, well, maybe this employee had a doctor's appointment and they didn't get to work until 7:30 today. So then it would be 6 hours from 7:30. It just depends on what your client would prefer. And then the deduction, I'm going to make it an hour deduction. So in this case, what I'm setting up is that my expectation is that the employee would punch for lunch. But if the employee fails to punch for lunch, the elapsed deduct will take over. In other words, if the employee has worked more than 6 hours, the system will automatically deduct the 1 hour of lunch. But the employee has to work more than 6 hours. And the 6 hours start from the actual shift time. The duration, again, this is going back to the employee being able to punch for lunch. The expected duration of the punch is 1 hour. Now, because this is not a paid lunch, I'm not paying outside of that time. Because if this were a paid lunch, I could tell the system that if this employee goes beyond the 1 hour to go ahead and pay for that, but then I could also say how much time to pay for. So again, if it was a paid lunch, the duration is set at 1 hour, but if they go outside of that, I'm only going to pay 15 minutes outside of that. So that means if they went more than 15 minutes, that time would not be paid for. Now, typically, most clients definitely don't do this. If they say the lunch is being paid and it's for 1 hour, it's for 1 hour, and they don't pay any time more than that. But again, it all depends. The lunch SG max, that's what we call a swipe and go max. So if the company that you're working with has decided to use the swipe and go feature of the software, swipe and go, it is indeed just that. Swipe and go means the employee walks up to the clock, they simply swipe and go. If they're going to be punching for lunch or break, how does the system know to mark that particular punch as a lunch or break? That's because you're creating what we call a lunch swipe and go. If the lunch is set for, I think we said an hour, so here, if I make this an hour and 15 minutes, that means if the employee clocks out and they come back within an hour and 15 minutes, it will see that set of punches as lunch because I've activated a lunch swipe and go max at an hour and 15 minutes. Now, if that employee is gone longer than an hour and 15 minutes, that time frame will not be labeled as lunch. It will simply be an out punch and an in punch, but they will not have the attachment or label of lunch. Break, same rules apply. If we're going to do a swipe and go for break, let's say if you wanted a 15-minute break, I'd probably set this at 20 minutes. So the system knows that if the employee clocks out from 1 minute to 20 minutes, to view clocks out and back in from 1 minute to 20 minutes, to view that as a break. Anything longer would then be viewed as a lunch. Up to 21 minutes to an hour and 15 minutes, that would be viewed as a lunch. Okay? And then anything more than the hour and 15, of course, is just a standard out and in punch. Breaks also work the same way as it relates to if you want to have the employees punch for breaks or if there is some type of auto deduction for breaks. So again, once you activate this window, it does make the break area available. So you could say lunches or breaks are actually paid. Maybe there's no deduction if they are going to be paid. And then, of course, you could put in a duration of 15 minutes. And, of course, we don't pay anything outside of the 15 minutes. But all of that is indeed a possibility. In this case, I said I was not creating any breaks in this particular shift. So I'll just clean all of that up. Now for the exceptions. In the exceptions area, you do have the opportunity to tell the system certain time frames that you're looking for either in punches or out punches. So in this scenario, I could tell the software, let me see anyone who clocks in from 6:01 to 6:30. So that's an in punch. But then on the out punch, maybe I want to see any employees that clock out from 2:30 to 2:59. And I'm going to switch that to an out punch. In other words, the exception is I want to see anyone who's coming in late, at least by 30 minutes, and anyone who's trying to leave early by 30 minutes. That is an exception. At the bottom, all I need to do is click OK. And I have added the first shift into the training shift group, which is the 6 to 3 shift. Again, I can add others simply by clicking Add. And notice what happens. It keeps the same parameters as our first shift. So here I'm just going to relabel this shift number 2. Going to make it 7 o'clock. The cutoff is 7:30. and we'll switch that to 4 p.m. In the exceptions, we'll do a quick change here. We'll make that 7:01 to 7:30. We'll make that 15:30 to 15:59, and we'll keep all of the lunch information, all of the rules exactly the same. We'll click OK here, and just that fast, we have created a second shift. Also note, if I went to the second shift and I clicked Add again, it would then pick up the rules from that particular shift. So potentially I could add another shift here. And then, of course, we could clean up the exceptions. And we can click OK here. So once you get started with creating the shifts are very easy to be added into the software. Now remember, I also explained that differentials were associated with the shifts. So again, notice the last tab is the differential. So it's still connected to the training shift group. I can click Add here, and I can tell the system that any employees that clock in from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. on Sunday and Saturday actually receive a differential. Not Monday through Friday. It's very easy to get people to work that shift Monday through Friday, but Sunday and Saturday, it's a tad difficult. So I can click OK here, and that is the differential that has been added into that window. Any questions about shift configuration? All right, then we'll go ahead and close here. Take us back to system setup, and now we're coming down to holidays. In the holiday section, this is actually where we are building the specific holidays. Remember, I explained to you earlier that in the policy area, that's when we decided the rules by which holidays would be granted. If you had an eligibility period or how much time you would receive. But this is officially where we define what holidays are going to be paid. The first question I generally like to pose here, is it safe to say that all employees at the company receive the same set of holidays? Some companies say, well, no, we have employees that only work Monday through Friday, so all of their holidays are actually viewed Monday through Friday. But then we have some employees that actually work 24/7. So when a holiday falls on Sunday, they get it on Sunday. When it falls on Saturday, they actually receive the holiday on Saturday. If that is the case, that's why you would need this group section to the bottom. As a prime example, let's add, although this holiday has passed, but Independence Day this year, it actually fell on a Sunday. Well, in this case, it is going to be active, override the absent allowed. Again, I don't want to show absent. I just want the holiday to be paid out. I don't want to see absent and holiday, just the holiday. And then remember in the policy where we talked about the secondary rate, if an employee worked on this holiday, it could be paid at a different rate, which is the secondary. Well, if this is one of those holidays, then this is where you would activate this feature. But in the example that I gave earlier, I said it only applied to Christmas and I believe Thanksgiving. So, of course, we would not activate that particular item here. But because this Sunday, Independence Day, maybe Group 1 is considered to be our 24/7 employees. And this is the only caveat with this. You can't relabel these groups. So you'd have to know that Group 1 is literally your 24/7 employees. We'll click OK here. And that adds the holiday to the left side. But then I would need to go back and I would need to add. Didn't do that. And I would uncheck Group 1 and I would make this for Group 2. Because this group would then be my Monday through Friday group of employees. And the holiday, again, is Independence Day, but it is observed on Monday, July 5th. I click OK here, and the holiday is in place. Now, let's say for Labor Day, it falls on a Monday by default, and that would apply to both of my groups, my 24/7 as well as my Monday through Friday group. So that is the holiday section. Remember, we have not arrived to the area where employees are assigned to holiday groups, but that will be in session 2 on tomorrow. This is only the window where we create the actual days that are considered to be holidays. And if there are groups, then you need to separate them accordingly. You can have up to 4 groups of holidays in this particular product. At the bottom, we'll go ahead and close here. And now we're headed back to System Setup and then down to Groups. Now remember, groups in the software have one primary purpose. It is all about security. Security is where we're saying, well, if you're going to have managers or supervisors in the system, and you want those managers or those supervisors to only have access to a certain set of employees, well, this is where we are determining what that set of employees or who that particular set of employees are. Do know we do not do them based on labor levels. I know a lot of companies or a lot of time and attendance vendors will do their security based on departments. Again, we don't base it on departments because maybe you have this huge department of 100 employees, but you have 5 managers, and each of those managers actually gets a set of 20 employees. Well, we want to be able to further break that down. So that's why we do it according to groups. Here is where I'll just create a group. So I'll go ahead and make this the training group. Make it active here. Click OK. And that is the training group. Now, let me say this. I know right now this section may seem a little fuzzy to you, but tomorrow when we begin to work with security in the system, hopefully it will become a lot clearer for you. All right. We'll go ahead and close here. Take us back to System Setup and then down to Location and Job. Remember, back in Company, under Main Company, we did actually switch that out to be Location, but I can actually switch it back to being Department. And now it's relabeled as Department. So remember, you do have that type of control. We'll go ahead and open the department area. And in the department section to the left side of the screen, this is actually where you'll see a list of all of the departments. Now remember, the list looks kind of similar to what we saw in groups, but not completely, because the groups are, again, completely separate from departments. Now granted, I do have some clients that certainly mirror their departments as a group, because departments are definitely how they want to do their security. And you can, of course, do that. Here we're going to add a new department into the software. So at the bottom, I'll click Add. We'll go ahead and code this out as number 5. The name here will simply be Training. It is going to be active, the use of an hourly wage. Remember we talked about using level wages and things like that? Well, this is where we would activate to use a level wage. Now, caveat here. When we use level wage, you have to be considerate of the levels that are in play. In this case, we activated Department and Job. Only one level can be associated with wage. You can't say, well, I want to use departments and associate wages to departments and also use jobs and associate wages to jobs, because essentially every employee is going to be assigned to a department and to a job. Well, which level wage is going to outrank the other? And it is always going to be the lowest level. So do know the goal is that if you're going to use level wages, that it is associated, or that the wages are associated with one particular level. Either it's going to be departments that have the level wage, or it's going to be jobs that have the level wage, but not both levels. Because remember, you would actually be confusing the system. And when you confuse the system has made a decision that I am going to accept the lowest level. In this case, that would be the job level. Here, for budgeted total hours, for budgeted total dollars, if you are planning to run budgeted versus actual reports, well, this is where you are defining the budgeted piece of information. So budgeted total hours. One thing to remember when you input these budgeted pieces of information, what time frame do these budgeted pieces of information cover? Do they cover a week, a month, a year? Because you need to know that when you begin to run the report. If the report actually, or you have decided to represent an entire week, well, the information that you have here should also represent a week, because if not, then your end result is going to be quite skewed. And that's also the same with the budgeted total dollars. Now, granted, client can always go back and change this information at any time. For hourly wage, in the hourly wage section, this is actually where you have the dollar amounts that you are inputting, meaning, remember the example that I gave earlier? I said it was a waitress. Everyone who works as a waitress makes $3.50. If that is the actual rate for that particular level, then you can apply it here. Now, if it is so that everyone has a different rate, then you may not want to put the hourly wage here, but you certainly want to activate the use of the hourly wage. So a little bit later, I can go back and show you when we arrive into that employee screen. You'll see this tomorrow, how you can actually input a specific rate of pay based on a particular level. So again, if they work in training, they can make this rate. If they work in sales, they can make this rate of pay. And it's different per employee. Right? At the bottom, I'll click OK here, and we have created a new department into the software. I'll close here, take us back to System Setup, and bring us down to Jobs. Notice the Jobs section is made up exactly like the Department section, meaning all of the questions here. We'll click Add here. I'll call this as Job 1. And we'll say that this is TA100 Pro. It will not use an hourly wage because I activated the hourly wage to be used based on the department. So we'll click OK here. I'll create job number 2. We'll say that this is Genesis Pro. And I'll create one more. And this is Genesis SQL. And maybe one more for the fun of it. TA100 Lite. So those are all of the jobs that an employee will have an opportunity to be associated with. Primarily, these jobs are pretty much associated with training, but again, you would have other jobs. Remember, there is only one job list and there is one department list. So when you create a department and you're going to use jobs in all of those different departments, you're going to have one job. So every job from training, every job from sales, every job from whatever other department may have been listed there, all of the jobs are still put into one job list. There's only one list. I know so many times clients will say, well, when you select a department, we only need this set of jobs to be available. The software doesn't work that way because it is a list. It's a list of departments and a list of jobs. They're independent of each other. Any questions about the labor level configuration? All right, we'll go ahead and close there, take you back to System Setup. Now, the next item that we have here, this is actually what we consider to be an extra module. It is bill scheduled. Now, keep in mind, here at Time America, we do not sell bills. What we do sell is what we call a relay module. The relay module actually allows the software to communicate to the clock and say, hey, it's time for the bell to ring. And it's getting that information from the time at the clock, And so think of the relay as the middleman between the clock and the bell. That's the piece that we're selling here. In the software, you can, of course, assign the specific times that you expect the bell schedule to actually run. If I click Add here, let's say I label this as bell schedule number 1, and we'll call it a training schedule. I'll click Add here, and it could be Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. The time is at 8 a.m., and we want it to sound for 3 seconds. The duration is always in seconds. Literally, how long do you want this bell to ring? At 8 o'clock. So it's 3 seconds. I'll click Add again. We'll say here, 12 noon, 2 seconds, because this is for lunch. And then we'll go in again. And no, there is no shortcut for identifying the days of the week. Also note the time. You don't see an AM, PM window there. So that means it is in military time. So this is a return from lunch. And then the end of the day. Go ahead and make that 1700, and it sounds for 3 seconds. If I need to make changes to any of the information here, maybe I want to increase the lunch to be for 5 seconds versus 2 seconds. To the right side of the screen, bottom corner, we can just make that 5. Notice as soon as I tab out of it, it automatically updates it here. I can go to 1300, switch that over to 5 as well. As soon as I tab out of it, it automatically updates it here. So all changes are definitely possible in the software. I'll click OK here, and it's a done deal. Now remember how bell schedules work. A bell schedule is actually assigned to the clock. So just in a little bit, when we do go into clock configuration, you will see how I will assign this bell schedule to a clock. Right? Now, also note, there can only be one bell schedule associated to a clock. So if your company that you're working with has like 3 different shifts, they have the 7 o'clock shift, they have the 3 o'clock shift, they have the 11 o'clock shift. That means all of the possible bell times that they want to have included need to be within this one bell schedule because they only have one clock and they have these 3 different shifts. So all of the bells, anytime they want that bell to ring for any one of those shifts, need to be included in this one bell schedule because you can only assign one bell schedule to a clock. Any questions about the bell configuration? All right, at the bottom, let's go ahead and click Close here. And now the last extra module that we need to share with you is indeed the benefit accruals. If I go back to daily operations, down to benefit accruals, and yes, benefit accruals is listed under daily operations and not a part of system setup. Just simply how the software is designed. As we head over to configure, open that window, you'll notice there is already one policy in place, and this one is full-time or FT hourly employees. Because remember, a benefit accrual policy is actually based on the types of employees that you have at that particular company. If you have employees that are part-time that receive benefits, well, they may accrue at a different rate versus those full-time employees. Or maybe you have executives. Maybe they also accrue at a different rate. Or maybe they even have different categories of time that they accrue as well. All of that is a possibility. Let's have a closer look at this particular policy. So we'll click Edit here. Notice this policy consists of paying out personal time, sick time, and vacation time. So that's what the accumulator is. It's telling you what this full-time hourly employee, what they can actually accrue, what types of time they can actually accrue. Now, the categories to some section. There are some companies that actually pay out time or allow you to accrue time literally based on the actual hours that you have worked. Well, when companies do that, they then have to dictate, well, what categories do we apply based on work time? Is it just work time? Meaning that any hour that you work, just the work time is accruing. Or is it work time and holiday? Typically, work time and holiday do go together. As an employee, you have no control over what the company holidays are, so they still allow you to accrue time based on the holiday. So again, you have work time, you have holiday, both of those are possibilities. Some companies may also include PTO. So it just depends on how they've come up with their numbers and what those numbers are based off of, what type of time. Now, with that, typically, definitely regular hours, but you could also associate overtime. So if you add overtime, it doesn't mean that the employee typically gets more time or accrue more hours. It tends to mean that they actually accrue the hours faster for someone who works a lot of overtime versus someone who doesn't work a lot of overtime. They accrue the hours faster because certainly there is more than likely a cap. If we said, yes, the employees are able to accrue up to 60 hours, well, the person who works the overtime may certainly get there much faster than the person who doesn't work a lot of overtime. But again, it's all based on their rules. Let's have a closer look at how these particular items are activated. Click Edit here. So the personal time. Notice the accumulator to the top left corner here is grayed out because it is already something that has been created. The posting basis on this is annual. So every year, based on the hire date, this employee will receive the number of hours listed in the accumulator details. And just at a quick glance, that's basically 40 hours. It doesn't change because notice there are no stages here. It doesn't say after year 2 or after year 5 or after year 10. It's only one row here. So that means it will always be 40 hours. Personal time never decreases to 60 hours or 80 hours. Every year, they could be with the company 20 years, they still get 40 hours of personal time. But the posting basis, these are all of your options as it relates to a posting basis. This one just happens to be annually. The start date. I typically like to set the start date back to what I consider to be the oldest employee at the particular company, which is 1900. But if the company, let's say, has just started to use this particular type of benefit, maybe the company hasn't always paid personal time. Maybe this is something that they just started in 2005. Then certainly you want the start date to represent their true start date of using or creating this particular policy, because maybe it's not as old as the oldest person working at that particular company. The gift, and that's exactly what I refer to it as, although it says give, I do refer to it as a gift, because it is a gift of time that you are gifting to the employee. In other words, you could say, if you stay with us for 3 months, then I will go ahead and give you 16 hours after your 3rd month. That's a gift of time. Okay? The reference date, you have 3 options for the reference date. In other words, when will this employee get the 40 hours? Is it going to be based on their hire date? Is it going to be on another fiscal date? Or is it going to be some other date completely, such as January 1st or July 1 or September 1st? Those are some other dates that I have certainly seen. Remember, this fiscal date is actually assigned in the employee screen. Every employee will have a hire date field. Every employee will have a fiscal date field. That is where those actual dates are assigned. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use the fiscal field. It just depends if that's what your policy calls for. Some companies say, well, all of our benefits don't officially kick in until you've been with the company for 30 days. So they will actually use that fiscal field to make it so. meaning that you don't get your time on your anniversary. Your time is always granted 30 days after your anniversary date. That's what the software would do here. To not give hours if employee status is inactive. Again, we haven't got to the area where we talked about making employees inactive. But in the software, I typically don't recommend that we delete employees out of the system, but I do recommend that we make them inactive. But that's certainly for people that have been terminated. Well, what about for someone who, for whatever reason, maybe they're on some type of medical leave? When that person is on medical leave, do you want to not allow them to accrue time? If so, you certainly have the option to go ahead and check the box here that says do not accrue if the status is listed as inactive. So someone on medical leave, if you have made them inactive, they will not accrue time. And in the accumulator window, if I click edit here, this is actually where you're building those details. Notice you can control the year and month. So the start of this is always at the beginning, the first year, the first month. Notice 0. Everything starts at 0. But everything is also paid at the end of whatever that accrual cycle is. And here we said posted annually. This doesn't mean that as soon as the employee hires on, they're going to get 5 hours. It means at the end of the annual cycle, they are going to get 40 hours. Notice it says straight given hours at end. Everything that we pay out always happens at the end of the cycle. So one-time given hours, if I wanted this employee to actually receive the 40 hours up front, then this would be where I would give those 40 hours, initially right here up front. So again, if you want that to happen, you can certainly make it happen. But again, if not, the next time or the only time that that employee will see those 40 hours will be at the end of that cycle. The hours from categories to sum. Remember we talked about that first window on the screen that said categories to sum, and I said, well, you could check off the categories that will apply the time based on the hours worked. Well, this is where you are creating what that factor is. So if the factor is 0.0125 for every hour that you work in either work time, holiday, PTO, then that's what the system is going to pay out. But it is indeed expecting that employee to work. And then is there a minimum qualification? Companies that typically do hours from categories to sum do actually use the minimum hours needed. In other words, well, and also let me say this as well. Normally if they do hours from categories to sum, they don't base it on an annual time frame. They typically do it on a week. So it may be that this employee needs 40 hours in this week, and if they have the 40 hours in the week, then certainly they will be granted whatever that sum is. But if they don't have the 40 hours in that week, then they don't receive those actual hours. I also told you earlier that you could do a maximum. So this is why the person who works a lot of overtime, they may get to whatever, I'll say 60 hours. They may accrue the 60 hours much faster than someone who doesn't work overtime, but it still stops at 60 hours because that's the maximum of hours that they can ever have. The carryover. This is a very big question. Some clients use a carryover. Some clients refuse. They're like, well, it depends what client you're working with. If there is an annual carryover, this is where it needs to go. Could be 40 hours. Some clients say it's use it or lose it. So nothing actually carries over. And then the maximum total benefit hours. Maximum total benefit hours go back to, let's say when your clients started. Because, you know, most clients start with employees having some type of benefit balances. But they also want to put some new rule in place that says, well, employees are only able to accrue a certain number of hours going forward. In other words, we don't want anyone to have more than 500 hours of personal time. That's it. That's all we want you to have. Because you've heard of companies such as your government agencies, federal agencies, they have employees that actually retire a year or 2 years ahead of time because they have so much personal time, sick time, all saved up until it allows them to retire early. Well, this is where you can put a max on the total benefits that they are ever allowed to accrue. So if that max is 500, this is where you can put in 500. Otherwise, you can keep it just as it was. Any questions about that personal policy? I want to bring you to look at the vacation policy because notice the sick policy is pretty much just like the personal. It's an annual policy. Basically, they get 40 hours. But the vacation policy is different because, one, it is based on a posting basis of a monthly cycle, and secondly, it is done in stages. So this is what I was referring to when I said, well, after 5 years something happens, after 10 years something happens. All of that is here. This is where you can certainly make those changes. Notice the first cycle or the first stage, the employees actually receive the 6.666 hours every month. And I think that actually equates out to about 80 hours. So again, in the first, first 3 years, because notice here, third year, which means really when you see the number there, you have to think everything starts at the end. So that third year really means at the beginning of the fourth year because everything happens at the end. So third year really means at the end of the third year, which is the start of the fourth year, they will then go up and start to receive 10 hours every month, which is basically 120 hours on an annual cycle. And then at the end of the fifth year, the start of the sixth year, that employee will then receive 13.333 hours every month, which is about 160 hours when you look at it from an annual cycle. So this is what we mean by stages. And this is what you cannot do with just the basic benefit entitlement. It doesn't just automatically do that for you. But again, benefit accruals, you can build those rules into the software. Any questions about benefit configuration? All right, we'll go ahead and close here. And now the next section is our clock configuration. In the clock configuration section, that means we're headed over to communication and then down to configure. You'll notice in this window that there are just so many different clocks that the software has to offer. Again, the 500 and the 600, typically some of our older clocks. Along with those are the PC clocks, because again, you can create a PC clock in the 500 or the 600 series. Then, of course, we have all of our 700 series clocks. Those are our latest clocks, the 715, 745, 777, and, of course, the 785. The 780 is still here because we did start with the 780, but now if you purchase clocks, I don't believe we have any more 780s. So anything that you purchase now should actually be a 785. The task clocks, we do still have, or we can create, I won't say we have any in stock, but we can certainly create a task clock. A task clock is basically a TA100 clock turned into a true task clock where there's no software associated with the clock. Everything is literally done directly at the clock itself. So again, don't sell a whole lot of those. So it's typically not something that I discuss in training, but again, just know it is indeed available. The TA7000 clock, certainly we do not have any of those in stock to sell. That is an old clock that we did at one time sell. If for some reason you run into a client that certainly has that clock, that's the purpose of why it is still listed as a part of TA100 Pro, because certainly some clients do have it. We also have the hand reader. Again, you heard me mention the HP 50, the HP 1000, 2000, 3000, 4000. All of those are hand punch or hand reader units that the software will certainly support. Then you have the ATS series. The ATS series, it is not think of it as a clock that maybe you're working with a client. They were using some other automated time and attendance software, but you want to confirm if the clocks that that company is using, will they work with this particular software? Some clocks do. Not all clocks, but some clocks do. What you can do is you can send the clock in. They will put in a ATS EEPROM just to see if the EEPROM will work with that particular clock. And if so, then we simply have that clock listed as an ATS series, because the EEPROM is actually just created by ATS, so it just becomes an ATS clock. Now, of course, the clocks that I want to focus on today are the 500, the 600, the 700 series, and, of course, the hand readers. So one good thing to know, even if you looked at the agenda and you can see how the clocks are grouped together, so that must tell you something about the clocks. The 500 and the 600, the configuration screens are exactly the same. The difference being, and I'll open this one up for you. Notice here, the difference is in the 600 series, because you had an opportunity to buy what we call the version 5 or version 6 in the 600 series clock, this is the only difference. The version 5 actually presented 2 lines of display versus the version 6 only presented 1 line of display. So you had to actually tell it how many seconds you wanted the idle message to display versus how many seconds you wanted the date and time. So this screen is exactly like your 500 series screen, because the 500 clock only had 1 line of display. So of course you always had to determine how many seconds for the idle message and how many seconds for the date and time. Therefore, the configuration screens for the 500 to 600 exactly the same. So let's have a closer look at the 500. Again, the clock, because we're in edit mode, is already in code there for the clock number 1. As I said earlier, you can always change the name or the description, but you cannot change the code in the clock. We are going to make this clock as active. Now, typically for the description or the name, I have these clocks, or I will label these clocks as we begin to build them. I will label them according to the type of clock that I build. But in a client's environment, I always label the description based on where the clock is located. So if you told me the clock is located at the front door, then I'm typically going to label that as the description: the front door, the back door, the training room, the cafeteria, the break room. Because when you begin to poll or communicate with those clocks, you actually want to know where those clocks are situated. Now, for the communication, you'll find in the path there are several options: direct, LAN, Ethernet, modem. All of those are possibilities here. Depending on what you select from this window, that actually opens up information to the right side. So here, because we're resting in the LAN, you can see it opens the LAN section, which is where you have to define the baud rate, the LAN ID, converter, if you're still using that, the RTS ready to send or SD send data. If we switch it over, let's say, to Ethernet, you'll notice the IP address field becomes available because we have to include the IP address. So think of it as the IP address actually goes into 2 places. It goes directly into the software, and then it also goes directly into the clock. Right? Now, the IP address is not anything that you are expected to know. Your client would need to give you the IP address. We don't know what IP addresses are. That's the number or code coming from their network. And they have to say, on our network, we are going to view this clock as IP address such and such. So that's up to them. You will need an IP port. Typically the port, I can't say typically, but for the hand punch units, the port is normally 3001, but it certainly can be different for the 500, 600 clocks. If you had said modem, then the modem area would have opened here, where you have the baud rate and, most importantly, the phone number. Very important to remember here. wherever they are calling from, they need to include that information in this window. So if they're calling internally and they have to dial an 8 or a 1 or a 9, whatever it is, then you need to include that as a part of the phone number here. The start and stop answer window, I'm not a fan of building a start and stop answer window because it means that you can manually only communicate with the clock at that particular time. So let's say you built a start and stop window that allows you to communicate with the clock from 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. Well, you know, one day you get to work and you decided you wanted to manually poll the clock. You can't manually poll the clock. The clock is only open and available from 2 a.m. to 5 p.m. And you can't even poll the clock or poll to the clock to say undo that until 2 a.m. to 5 a.m. So I'm not a big fan of doing the start and stop answer window. The ring delay, if that clock, or shall I say that modem line, is being shared with maybe another device, a fax machine, or something of that nature, then certainly you may have to include a ring delay so the software knows, don't pick me up until, you know, the 5th ring or the 4th ring. The number of retries, depending on which mode you're going, LAN, Ethernet, modem, you certainly can have the system retry. Maybe there was a system, especially with the modem, you know, the modem line, anything could be happening on that line. So we certainly may want to do a number of retries for that. And back-end communication, remember you do need a COM port. In other words, what cable, what port is that cable coming out of? What port? That's the purpose here. And of course, the serial baud on these particular clocks, the default is 9600. The miscellaneous section, the time difference between computer and clock. Here, you can go negative or positive, because remember, it depends on where the system is in relation to where the clock is. Think of it this way. If the system itself was in New York, but the clock, of course, was in California, then we would need to go into the negative. But if it were the reverse, if the system were in California and the clock were in New York, then we'd need to go a positive. The division, every clock that you create can automatically be associated with a specific division, which means all of the punches from this clock automatically associate with that division. You can make that happen here. The supervisor prefix for entry, and there is a prefix for recall. The prefix for entry is typically 11. That's what we classify as a supervisor badge. Again, when you purchase, if you're going to use a TA100, TA600, you will typically get a set of badges that come with 11001 and 11002. Those are supervisor badges, meaning that a supervisor could use one of those badges, walk up to the clock, and if they need to, they could add a punch or what have you. Because it's an entry badge. It allows you to enter information for an employee. The prefix for recall says, what if an employee wants to see their punch information? That is a recall badge. That badge actually has the prefix of 10. The prefix of 10 then entitles the client or employee just to walk up, swipe that badge, put in their badge number, and they can see all of their punch information that is still residing in the clock. Now, that is pending they did not clear the clock of all the punches, or whoever pulled the clock didn't clear the clock of the punches. A recall badge is typically a badge that just stays at the clock, because it's not as though someone can do harm from that particular badge being there. The default date, the default time, for someone, a supervisor who, of course, will be making entries in the clock, you can actually have it set to default date and the default time. Now, for the input, you notice how the input is set in two separate sides, one to the left, one to the right. The initial source, think of this from the employee perspective. What's the expectation? Are we expecting this employee to use magnetic swipe badges to clock in? Are we expecting them to use barcode badges to clock in? Or maybe they don't use any kind of badges at all. All they do is just pin punch in, just key punch in right at the clock. So again, this is the employee perspective. Now, the right side is the supervisor perspective. When the supervisor goes to this clock to do something for an employee, how do you want the supervisor to add that employee's number into the system? Do you want them to use that employee's badge, their magnetic badge, to swipe it? So it means they have to get the badge from the employee. Do you want them to use the barcode badge? Again, they have to get the badge from the employee. Or do you want them just to be able to key in that employee's number at the clock and do what they need to do? Again, it's all about what the client wants to be able to do. And most clients, believe it or not, they really don't prefer to do any of this editing, I won't say editing, but any of this adding information at the clock. They much rather prefer to do it directly in the software. The second tab is the Configure tab. In the Configure tab, you have the timeout. In the timeout area, this is where the software says, I'm going to give you so many seconds to do exactly what you need to do. For example, to input data, you get about 1 minute. To enter a specific function, so if you're not in swipe and go mode, when you swipe the badge, the employee gets a message that says enter function. It gives them 20 seconds to decide what function they are going to enter. Are they clocking in? Are they clocking out? Exactly what are they doing? Displayed messages. Any messages that come across, like the message that says enter function, well, that message is going to stay across there for 2 seconds. The supervisor questions. When you are in supervisor mode, the software does allow you 90 seconds because there's a lot of information going across that screen. Hence, that's why I said a lot of companies don't allow supervisors to do those types of edits and corrections from the software. Error messages. This may be the one item that I may say you want to think about changing, only because that 1.5 seconds is not enough time to really see what that may have been. That's probably the one that I would certainly increase maybe to 5 seconds, because you have to realize people are not expecting to see that item. So if they're not expecting to see the item, it certainly catches them off guard. So again, you do want to maybe increase that one. Now, to the right side, the messages area. Again, enter function. I would probably not change that unless the only function that my employees could do would be to clock in and clock out. Then maybe versus saying enter function, maybe I would go enter in or out, but that would be it. No other reason to change the function. The invalid source, the source actually goes back to this area here. For example, if you have purchased from us, let's say a magnetic swipe clock, the clock that we sent out to you or to your client is a magnetic swipe clock. But yet for some reason, maybe we made a mistake and we sent you barcode badges. Well, that's going to be an invalid source. People are going to see that message because they're trying to use barcode badges in a magnetic swipe clock. Doesn't work out very well. The invalid badge. In the software, all of our badges come ready to use. You could take a badge right out of the packaging and give it to an employee, and that employee would be able to clock in because all badges are valid right out of the packaging. If someone should ever get the message that says invalid badge, it is because someone has gone into the system in their personal screen and they have switched the badge to being invalid. It's the only way that an invalid badge can make it so. Invalid level, going back to the labor levels. Maybe you're having employees transfer into departments or transfer into jobs. Well, if they're transferring, let's say if somebody tried to transfer into job 700, that's going to be an invalid level. It does not exist. The item message, Time America. The item message can contain up to 16 characters, Most companies do prefer to put the company name, which means when you walk up to that clock, you're going to see the idle message, which may be the company name. And in addition to that, it's going to switch out, and it's going to show you the date and time. Notice here we've set it for 2 seconds. So for 2 seconds, you'll see the date and time, and 2 seconds, you'll see the idle message of Time America. Swipe and Go badges. Remember, we talked about Swipe and Go earlier today, and we said when you activate Swipe and Go, you also have to activate the lunch and break Swipe and Go feature, so the system will know that that is lunch and break. And in addition to that, you also have to tell the system which badges are going to be associated as Swipe and Go. Now, if the company is saying, well, everyone is actually going to be Swipe and Go, the best thing to do is set this at all 9. But if they have decided to have some employees actually enter functions versus some employees use Swipe and Go, then of course, maybe those people that are all set to be Swipe and Go, maybe the highest badge number that they have could be 500. So any badge that is 501 or over, those employees will then be using functions, meaning they would swipe the badge, they would say enter function, versus any employee that has a badge number less than 500 would then just be in Swipe and Go mode. So all of that is a possibility. The extra items that you have here, the feedback enhancer. The feedback enhancer is basically this little gray box that you can attach to the clock, and it has a red light and it has a green light, and it makes a very loud noise. So it's great for industries on the floor in the shop area where it's very loud, very noisy. People will know if they've had a successful punch, or they will know if they've had a bad punch, because they can hear it and see the lights as they appear. The skip recording of the diagnostic and programming information, I would not recommend that you activate this feature, because if there is a problem, you want to be able to go back, or at least my technical support team, they want to be able to go back and see how the clock was programmed. You know, when you call and you say, well, the clock isn't doing what we told it to do. Well, let's see exactly what was programmed into that clock. The display idle time in military format. Remember earlier, back in the main company, we talked about displaying AM, PM format, and I told you that applied only to the software. And it applied to 2 sections in the software, the time card and the report section. But I told you when you begin to work with the physical clocks, you had a separate designation for that. So what you want to know is that all of your clocks, the 500, 600, 700 series, all of these clocks by default display in AM, PM format. If you want those clocks to display in military format, you would need to check the box here. The transaction print, you can attach a small printer to each one of these clocks. I think it's called P90 or PX90 or something like that. You can attach a printer to these clocks, and every time an employee clocks in or clocks out, you can actually have a receipt print to that employee. On that receipt, you can control the first 2 lines. So some companies may have the company name here, and then on the second line, they may have maybe like a slogan or some type of theme in this particular or on this particular row. But literally, you're just controlling the first 2 lines of that receipt that the employee has received from the printer regarding that transaction. And then the very last item that you have here, it is the bill schedule. Remember when we were just creating the bill schedule, I told you at that time you can only assign 1 bill schedule to any clock that you're working with. So here, if you check the box, this is where you'll see the bill schedule that we actually created just a tad earlier. Any questions about this clock configuration? Again, if I cancel here and go back to configure 600, notice exact same window. Depending on what version, if you selected the 500 versus the 600, That will determine if you have to put the seconds between the idle message and the date and time. If you chose version 6, you have to do that. If you chose version 5, you do not need to do that. The version 5 clocks all come with the 2 lines of display. But speaking of the version 5, at this time I don't think there are any more version 5 TA100 clocks available. I think there are all version 6 now available. If you run into a 5, it may be a refurbished version 5. But definitely all the new clocks that are coming out are version 6. What I do want to point out here is the PC clock. Notice the PC clock, it can be built as a 500 or a 600. In this case, I decided to build it as a 600. But what you want to note here is the code must always be set to PC. Anytime you build a PC clock, the code must say PC. The description, completely up to you, but I just spell it out to be a PC clock. Otherwise, nothing else actually matters here because it is just a PC clock. Now, the configure information, well, that certainly does matter. It's the same window that we saw earlier. None of that changes. Same rules for the highest swipe and go. Because this is a PC clock, there is no transaction to print because remember the PC clock just appears right on the desktop. The bell schedule, remember there's no bell schedule associated with the PC clock. I mean, you could associate it, but nothing is going to happen. Because remember, it's not a physical clock per se. Right. Feedback enhancer, all of that's not valid because remember, it's not a physical clock. It's just a clock that appears in the window. All right. In fact, let me see if I can open one for you so you can just have a peek at it. That's the PC clock. And that's all it is. It just appears in the window. So I'm not sure if I have any employees that are set up to accept the badge, and yep, so this employee is not allowed to punch using the PC clock. I probably don't have any employees associated with it, but this indeed is how the PC clock looks. It's just a clock that literally appears right on the desktop. I'll take us back to communication down to configure, and now headed into our 700 series clocks. In the 700 series clock, what you will find is that the screen is typically exactly the same. So I'll go ahead and label this as clock number 3, and this is a TA715. Notice the path. You can either do direct, LAN, modem, or Ethernet, depending on what you select from this window. The right side will change. So say you selected Ethernet. And again, it's looking for an IP address on the IP port. Now, this IP port that is listed here is the standard port for these particular clocks, the 700 series. Also note the COM port, most importantly the serial baud. The serial baud, again, this is the default serial baud for the 700 series clocks. The miscellaneous information, exactly the same. None of that has changed. Again, you can go negative and positive, and you can always associate a clock with a division. The supervisor section. Notice you don't have a prefix for a supervisor badge. You don't have a prefix for a recall badge. When you're working with a 700 series set of clocks, you can take any badge and turn it into a so-called supervisor badge. Doesn't matter, because when you go into the section where you're creating the supervisor, that's where you will assign the badge there. So any badge can actually become a supervisor badge. The initial source. In this area, same rules apply. We talked about how the employee would clock in, and if the supervisor needed to do something for the employee, how would they get the employee's information in? The only difference here is when you're working with barcodes. These clocks have the opportunity to work with different types of barcode badges. So you do have to confirm what type of barcode badge you are actually using. And the second tab, the configure tab, again, all of the timeouts exactly the same. The messages area exactly the same. Notice you don't have an option for the date and time versus the idle message. because this clock actually offers 2 lines of display. The swipe and go badges, for the swipe and go badges, you can activate the use of swipe and go, but these particular clocks are a tad different. Even though you've activated swipe and go, they still will allow the function keys to be used. Unlike the 500, 600 series, once you activated the swipe and go, that automatically deactivated the function keys. Well, here, the function keys are still available. So if you want to deactivate the function keys, then you have to, of course, check the box to do so. The skip recording of the diagnostic and programming info, don't recommend it. The idle time, I already told you, by default is in AM, PM. If you want to push it into military, you can. And, of course, the bell schedule. What is missing here is the print transaction. This particular clock does not have that availability to connect to an actual printer at this time. Right? But again, you'll notice pretty much the same question, just some differences, a few things missing like the print for this clock. So we'll click OK there, and that creates the 715. Now, if we go back to configure, down to the TA745, what you will find here, we'll label this as clock 4, TA745. The TA745 clock has the opportunity to be a fingerprint reader. So, of course, you can say, well, it's not going to be a fingerprint reader, or it is indeed going to be a fingerprint reader. When you activate it to be a fingerprint reader, notice the new tab, because now you have to actually assign those templates for those fingerprints. This is where you're saying which employees should be associated with this clock. For example, I can add all of my employees. If I add all of the employees that I have in the software currently, about 5 employees, you'll notice the very last column where it says template. Well, none of these employees actually has a template on file, meaning they have not been enrolled in the system, or they have not been enrolled at the clock, and nor have we uploaded that information into the software, because maybe they have been enrolled, but we just haven't sent that information over to the software yet. All of those are a possibility. Here, the fingerprint mode, it is best to use verify and identify, which means the employee walks up to the clock, they key in a code, put their fingerprint in, and the system is actually verifying that fingerprint based on the identification that was provided. Now, identify only works a little, or it takes a little longer at the clock, because let's say you have a clock that has 100 employees. Identify is actually going to go through all 100 of those employees until it finds the specific employee that matches the fingerprint that was just issued there. So to quickly get through it, if we verify first, meaning, well, I'm looking for employee number 12345. Let's quickly get to that person's fingerprint and let's confirm it. That's why you typically want to use the verify plus identify. Below that, there are 2 new items. It says auto-assign new templates to this and other clocks, and send only templates that are not already in the clock. I like this particular feature because what happens is when you have employees that have been added to the system and you have these new templates coming over, wouldn't it be nice to go ahead and assign those templates to the clock? Now, that's only pending if the client hasn't said, well, all employees don't have access to all clocks. Now, if that's not the case, certainly you don't want to do this particular feature. That's seeing that everybody has access to all of the clocks. But if that's not the case, then again, don't recommend doing it. To send only templates that are not already in the clock. Absolutely. We want to send the templates down constantly. So if someone has been enrolled at 1 clock, we've uploaded the template is in the system, that employee has been assigned to all of these other clocks, we automatically want to send those templates down to those other clocks so that employee can do that. Before, you had to manually go in during the polling process, and you had to make that happen. But now we can actually automate that process for you. So that is definitely something that I would recommend. right here. The second tab over, just so you'll know, not a lot has changed here. There's one new feature, though, where it says proximity offset to remove facility code. In the TA745 clock, unlike the 715, the TA745, the 777, the 780, they accept proximity badges. But what you have to tell it if you're going to use the proximity badge is how many digits is the facility code. Most facility codes are 2, so you have to set that offset for that facility code. But of course, you can download the Bell schedule, and we know that the General tab is still the same tab. So that's the 745. In the 777, notice it is exactly the same. I don't think there is any difference here. Because you still can use this as a proc, so everything in this window is exactly the same as what we saw in the 745, with the exception the 777 clock is not a clock that is considered a fingerprint clock, so you cannot use it as a fingerprint clock. And then we'll have a look at the 785. Now, the 785 can, of course, be used as a fingerprint clock. So notice, remember, just as before in the 745, you had the none or the finger. Again, same rules apply on the assignment screen. The Configure tab, everything is exactly the same as it was in the 745. The General, everything is the same here. All right. We'll create that. And the last set of clocks that I want to discuss with you are the hand readers. Remember, it's not until you get into the hand reader clock that you're then deciding what type of clock is it going to be, a 1,000 or 50, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. That's where you are then making that particular decision. The idle prompt, just as with all of the other clocks, there was an idle message that you could have. Idle prompt, idle message, still the same thing. This is a message that goes across on this clock. Now the difference, though, with all of the other clocks, the 500, 600, 700 series, the idle message was 16 characters. In the hand punch unit, the idle message or idle prompt is only 14 characters. So you do lose 2 characters. The communication type, again, what type of clock is it going to be? Modem, Ethernet, serial LAN. If it is modem, you need to put in the modem phone number. If it is Ethernet, you need to put in the IP address. Notice this is the standard IP port for the hand punch unit. You do have the option with the time difference, so of course you can make that happen here. The division, you can always associate any clock with a division. Because this is a hand punch unit, again, meaning we have to go back to creating those templates. They have to create their hand template. That means you have an assignments tab. So again, I could add all of my employees, but notice that last column, it says there are no templates on file. That means I'm waiting because I still need to assign those employees or enroll those employees into the system so that I can retrieve those templates and put them back into the software. As always, auto-assign new templates to this and other clocks. If you want to do that, just remember, it means anytime that you get a new template, you can go ahead and automatically assign it to other clocks. I always recommend that you do, but again, it just depends on the situation or that environment. For the miscellaneous, it starts with the Bell schedule, so certainly you can assign the Bell schedule. The site, I've never had the site code actually change from 1. The access duration of how much time am I going to give you to do what you need to do at that clock. Here, it does go with 10 seconds. Access tries. In other words, if you walk up to that clock and the first time around you key in the code, you put your hand in and it says, nope, not accepting you. Well, you have 5 more times that you can try to do that because it will give you 6 opportunities. If after the sixth opportunity, it will, of course, lock you out. But the lockout is only temporary. As soon as someone comes along that can successfully clock in, you can try all over again for another 6 times. The reject threshold. 125 is what is considered as a reject threshold. But ultimately, it is it's just a number that says this is the max that we don't want to go outside of. If it's more than 125, then that's probably not you. Think of it this way. Anytime you use a hand punch unit and you enroll employees into that unit, you are receiving a number or a code, and that code represents that employee. So every time that employee goes back to that clock and they clock in, they are giving a number. They're given a number that represents how close they are back to their original template. The lower the number, the closer you are. The higher the number, the further away you are from that original template. So the highest possible number is set at a reject threshold of 125. That's important because in some cases, let's say there are twins working at a particular company, and their hands are basically almost the same shape, same size. But that's what a hand template looks at. It's not a fingerprint template. It's a hand template. So it's literally looking at the shape and size of an employee's hand. If you have twins, their shapes and sizes of their hands could be very closely similar. So that means you may want to drop the reject threshold on an individual employee. But ultimately, the largest reject threshold overall is 125. Now, some employees, you may want to raise the reject threshold. Maybe you have someone employed that has a bad case of arthritis, and sometimes that can have a flare-up, and it has their hand just a tad swollen. So again, you may want to raise their particular threshold. The keypad beeps. When the employee walks up to this particular clock, the system, when they click the numbers or the function keys, they can have it beep. Or if you don't want a sound, you do not have to have it beep. How will the time be displayed at this particular clock? I think I mentioned to you earlier in the 500, the 600, the 700 series, all of those clocks by default display the time in AM/PM form and time. But if you prefer to see it in military time, you always have the option to switch it out. Well, the hand readers work a little different. They work in the reverse. The hand punch units will always display the time by default in military or 24-hour format time. If you want to see it, or you want your employees to see it in AM/PM time, you have to check the box here that says 12-hour display. And most people do end up checking the 12-hour display. The mode, well, that depends on how you're going to use the hand punch unit. It's kind of like activating swipe and go. No menu means you're definitely activating swipe and go. You want the employees just to walk up, key in the code, put their hand in, and keep it moving. The punch menu, meaning you want employees to literally go through a screen that says what you're doing. Are you clocking in or are you clocking out? What exactly is your function at the clock? That's the punch menu. The password. With any hand punch unit, there are always 5, think of it as 5 levels of access that a hand punch unit will allow someone to do. The service group, if you need to service the particular unit. Setup, if you need to set up, like, for example, the IP address. I think I told you earlier, the IP address would go into the software. It would also go directly into the clock. So if this particular clock needed an IP address, that's going to be the setup part of it. Management, you need to get in the management area to add a punch. That's the management access level. Enrollment, you need to go in and enroll a new employee at this clock. That is the enrollment level. Or special, you need to special enroll someone. Because remember what a special enrollment is. It's ultimately where you're not putting their hand in. It could be their fist print, or It could be one finger. Special enrollment literally accepts anything, but you're just giving the employee the impression that they have to put something in place. And for the function keys, in this particular clock, I think we apparently chose the HP 3000. It does come with 2 function keys. If you want the employees to be able to use maybe function key 1 for department transfers and function key 2 for job transfers, this is where you can make that happen. So this is your hand reader. I'll click OK here. And we have created a hand reader clock in the system. Any questions about clock configuration? All right. Well, once you have the clocks all in the software, then becomes the part where you have to communicate or poll those clocks. Also under communication is poll. If we click poll here, you'll notice there are 2 tabs, and this is a manual way to poll the clock. We haven't talked about an auto process. Auto process is coming up in just a moment. But to manually poll the clock, communications and poll, 2 tabs. The first tab is where we're deciding which clocks we want to communicate with. I can choose individual clocks. I can choose all of the clocks. Doesn't matter. Completely up to the end user when they manually poll that clock. Polling options. In the polling options area, think of this section as saying, when we do open the lines of communication, what are we going to chat about? Because that's essentially what you're deciding here. If absolutely nothing in this area were checked, it means we would just be opening the lines of communication and nothing would be happening. Kind of like teenagers sometimes when they get on the phone, they are talking on the phone, but the phone lines are open, but nobody's saying anything. So somebody is, especially if it's on the cell phone, somebody's paying for those minutes and nobody's saying anything. Same rules apply here. The lines of communication are open, but we need to chat about something. So one main thing that we always want to chat about are the transactions. Send those transactions back into the software. That's the primary goal of polling, to see all of the in punches, the out punches back into the system. The clear clock transactions, if you notice, it's only available when we decide to poll. If we are not polling, clear clock transactions is not available. The clear clock transactions is certainly something I do recommend that you do, but it also depends on how else you plan to use the clock. Remember I said earlier about that the retrieve key or the badge pin that allows you to review punch information? Well, if employees, or if you expect employees to be able to review punch information, then you probably don't want to clear the clock. If you clear the clock, well, they'll never be able to view any of their punch information. So again, it just depends on how you're going to set up the clock. Now, one thing to consider, though, at some point in time, you do want to clear at least the 500 and 600 clocks, and the 700 clocks. You do want to clear those clocks because they do not automatically clear themselves. And eventually, that means if they do not clear themselves, you will begin to see such notes or messages as memory low, because that clock is literally running out of space because you haven't cleared all of those actual punches out of it. The set clock date and time. When you poll a clock, you do have the opportunity to set the date and time as a part of the polling process. The program clock. Well, everything that we just discussed in communications configure, that was us programming the clock. If we want the clock to know what we've just told it to do, we have to load that information into the clock. So that's programming the clock, taking all of the rules, the settings that we created in configuration, and pushing them out to the clock. The loading of the bell schedule. If you are indeed going to be including bell schedules in the software, you will need to check this feature because this is how those bells will be associated to that clock. Loading messages. The messages here are personal messages. We haven't arrived into the employee section just yet that allows you to send a personal message like happy birthday or meeting at 2 p.m. All of those are personal messages. But messaging is a two-step process. You go one place in the employee area to create the message, but then you have to load the message to the clock. Because if you just create the message and you never load the message to the clock, the employee will never see the message. Now for hand readers, this section is specifically for the fingerprint templates, the hand readers, anything that contains a template. One, remember we said when you enroll an employee at the clock, whether it's a fingerprint, a hand reader, you want to retrieve those templates. But now, as a part of that process, you can have the system automatically do that for you by checking that feature that we talked about earlier. Again, if you were going in to do a manual poll and you had just entered an employee in the software and you wanted to make that happen manually, you always have the right to make it happen manually, to retrieve any template of your choosing. If you needed to send templates, meaning that you had retrieved the templates, you had assigned the employees templates to all of the clocks that they're supposed to have access to. Now you want to send those templates out to those other clocks. Again, you can always manually do that as well. Clearing the templates. Clearing the templates is typically one that I try to stay away from, only because clearing the templates literally means that you are clearing all of the templates out of the clock. Now, no worries if you happen to clear all of the templates out of the clock. Just remember, the templates are still in the software, so you can always go back and send templates back out to the clock. Because we would hate to have a situation where we have 500 employees and we've cleared the templates, and now we have to go back and re-enroll all 500 employees. Not a good experience. So again, that's why it's important not just to have employees when they enroll at one clock, just to keep the template there, but you need to retrieve those templates so those templates are actually embedded in TA100 Pro, the software itself. And then finally, process punches after polling. I encourage all clients anytime you are polling the clock to always process the punches after polling. Literally what happens is when the polling process is done, it's now going to drop all of those punches and abide by all of those rules, so all of the rounding rules. It knows exactly what to do when that information is dropped into the time card, because it has taken into consideration the rounding rules, the shift rules, whatever, the lunch deductions, all of that has been taken into consideration because the information is processed information. Versus if you don't process it here, when you open the time card, you'll have to do a process there. So when I open the time card, I already like to see processed information. So at the bottom, once you have made a decision on exactly what you're going to poll, then you can go ahead and click poll here. Now, unfortunately, none of the clocks that I have created are actually attached or working clocks, so of course I'm not going to have a successful polling. But at the bottom, you would click poll, and eventually you would see a window pop up where one side you would have the clock, to the right side, to the left side you would have a computer, and you could see the arrows because it's always going to start sending information from the clock to the computer, because that is, it's polling the clock, so it's sending information to the computer. And then part two of that, if it has anything to upload to the clock, you're going to see the arrows reverse and go from the computer over to the clock, because that means it's programming the clock, or it's loading the date and time, it's loading the bell schedules, it's loading the messages, it's loading all of that information into the clock. And folks, that will actually conclude part one of our training session for today. Looking at the time, I think sometimes I get carried away. It is already 11:32. So what that means is tomorrow, when we start part two, which is our management portion, we will start part two with the auto process portion of the training. So we will start with sharing you how you can auto process something like the polling. because polling isn't the only thing that you can auto-process. You can auto-process reports as well. So again, we'll tell you how all of that works, because it is a 4-step process. So we will walk you through all 4 of those steps. But until then, questions, comments, concerns about anything that I have shared with you today in this particular training. I know it is a lot of information, but again, if you think of questions when we're done, just go ahead and jot those down, and we will always start the next section with questions from today as well. So before we go, any comments, questions, concerns? All right. Then, hearing none, I'd just like to say again, thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today. Really, really appreciate it. Hope you guys got something out of it. And we'll do this all over again tomorrow. So again, I'll see you in the same place, same time tomorrow, all over again on Thursday, July 15th. Thanks so much. Have a very good day.
Yeah, well, they were under maintenance when they first started, and they said, well, I guess they said they're never breaking, and also probably lost some breaking. Because they lost a couple of their schools, and one time, so probably they get cash, so, okay, what can we cut, you know?
Never fails. Look, I already got my computer turned off and everything. Every time. Yes, dear. Okay. Now, another thing I thought of is we could try to reinstall the workstation